Some stories are written to entertain, others are written because the world demanded they exist. Welcome! This is a third-person retelling of Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad, a story inspired by a real-life nightmare. The core idea came from Conrad's own journey up the Congo River in 1890, where he witnessed unspeakable colonial brutality firsthand. First published in 1899, the novella has since sold millions of copies worldwide. Its author, Joseph Conrad, is widely known for masterworks like Lord Jim and Nostromo. The story later reached an even wider audience when it was adapted for the big screen as Apocalypse Now in 1979. Just know the visuals you see are created by today's technology. They may not be perfectly accurate to every scene, but they will help you visualize the darkness ahead. So please, bear with my request. By the end of this journey, you may find yourself questioning the thin line between civilization and savagery. And at the end, I'll share fascinating facts about the book, its adaptations, behind-the-scenes details from the film, and a few dark discoveries most readers never notice. The story begins. The yawl. Nellie swung still at anchor, sails slack, the flood tide spent. With the wind nearly gone and the river current against them, she waited for the turn. The Thames stretched ahead like an endless watery road sea, and sky fused into a single luminous haze, where barges with tan sails appeared frozen in red clusters. Low shores dissolved into mist. Above Gravesend, the air darkened into a mournful gloom that seemed to brood over the greatest city on earth. The director of companies stood in the bow, and the four men watching him felt he looked more nautical than anything else on the river, like a pilot, trustworthiness made flesh. It was hard to believe his real work lay not in that bright estuary but behind him, inside the brooding gloom. They shared the bond of the sea, which made them tolerant of each other's stories. The lawyer had the only cushion. The accountant toyed with dominoes. Marlowe sat cross-legged against the mizzenmast, sunken-cheeked, arms dropped, palms out, resembling an idol. The director came aft and sat down. A few lazy words passed. Then silence. None began the dominoes. They felt meditative, fit only for staring. The day ended in serene, exquisite brilliance, Pacific water, flawless sky, the mist over the marshes like radiant gauze. Only the western gloom over the upper reaches grew more somber, each minute, as if angered by the approaching sun. The sun sank, in an imperceptible curve, changing from glowing white to a dull, rayless, heatless red, as though about to die suddenly, stricken by that brooding gloom over a crowd of men. A change came over the water. The serenity became less brilliant but deeper. The old river rested unruffled at decline of day, after ages of service to the people on its banks, now spread in tranquil dignity toward the earth's ends. They looked at it, not in the vivid flush of a short day, but in the august light of abiding memories. Anyone who had followed the sea with reverence could evoke the past here. The tidal current ran its unceasing service, crowded with memories of men and ships borne home, or to battle from Drake to Franklin, knights errant of the sea. All those ships, from the Golden Hind to the Erebus and Terror, had sailed here. Adventurers, settlers, kings' ships, merchants' ships, captains, admirals, dark interlopers, commissioned generals, hunters of gold and fame had gone out on this stream, bearing sword and torch. What greatness had not floated on this ebb into mystery? The dreams of men, seeds of commonwealths, germs of empires. The sun set. Dusk fell on the stream. Lights appeared on shore. The Chapman Lighthouse shone strongly. Ship lights moved in the fairway, a great stir of lights going up and down. Further west, the place of the monstrous town marked the sky ominously, a brooding gloom even in sunshine, a lurid glare under stars. Marlowe said suddenly that this too had been one of the dark places of the earth. He was the only one among them who still followed the sea. He was not typical of his class, a wanderer while most seamen led a sedentary life, Their home always the ship, their country, the sea. Foreign shores and faces glided past, veiled by a slightly disdainful ignorance, for nothing was mysterious to a seaman except the sea itself. Seamen's yarns had an effective simplicity, their meaning inside like a kernel. But Marlowe was not typical, and to him the meaning of an episode lay outside, enveloping the tale like a misty halo made visible by moonlight. His remark surprised no one. It was just like Marlowe. Silence accepted it. Then he said, very slow, that he had been thinking of very old times when the Romans first came, 1900 years ago. Light had come out of this river since then, like a running blaze on a plain, a lightning flash in clouds. They lived in the flicker. But darkness was here yesterday. He asked them to imagine a commander of a trireme in the Mediterranean, ordered suddenly north, rushed overland across Gaul, put in charge of a ship of legionaries, handy men who could build 100 in a month or two. Imagine him at the world's end, a lead-colored sea, a smoke-colored sky, a ship as rigid as a concertina, going up this river with stores or orders. Sandbanks, marshes, forests, savages, little fit to eat, only Thames water to drink. No Falernian wine, no going ashore. Military camps lost in wilderness like needles in hay. Cold, fog, tempests, disease, exile, death, skulking everywhere. Men dying like flies. He did it very well, no doubt, without thinking much, except later to brag. They were men enough to face the darkness. He might have been cheered by a chance of promotion to Ravenna's fleet if he survived the awful climate and had good friends in Rome. Or think of a decent young citizen in a toga, too much dice, perhaps coming out in the train of a prefect or tax-gatherer or trader to mend his fortunes, landing in a swamp, marching through woods, feeling the utter savagery close round him, all that mysterious life of the wilderness stirring in forests, jungles, hearts of wild men. No initiation into those mysteries. He had to live in the midst of the incomprehensible and detestable, and yet fascinating. The fascination of the abomination. Imagine the growing regrets, longing to escape, powerless disgust, surrender, hate. Then he began again, lifting one arm, palm outward, legs folded, the pose of a Buddha preaching in European clothes. He told them none of them would feel exactly like that. What saved them was efficiency, devotion to it. But those chaps weren't much account, not colonists. Their administration was just a squeeze. They were conquerors, needing only brute force, nothing to boast of since strength came from others' weakness. They grabbed what they could for what could be got. It was a robbery with violence, aggravated murder on a great scale, men going at it blind proper for those tackling a darkness. The conquest of the earth, taking it from those with different complexions or flatter noses, wasn't a pretty thing when examined too much. What redeemed it was the idea behind it, not a sentimental pretense, but an unselfish belief in something one could set up, bow before, and offer sacrifice to. He broke off. Flames glided on the river, small green, red, white flames pursuing, overtaking, joining, crossing, then separating. The great city's traffic continued on the sleepless river in the deepening night. They waited patiently, nothing else to do until the end of the flood. Only after a long silence, when he said in a hesitant voice that he supposed they remembered he had once turned freshwater sailor for a bit, did they know they were fated before the ebb began to hear about one of Marlowe's inconclusive experiences. He began by saying he didn't want to bother them much with what happened to him personally, showing the weakness of many tale-tellers, unaware of what an audience best likes to hear. Yet to understand its effect on him, they ought to know how he got out there, what he saw, how he went up that river to where he first met the poor chap. It was the furthest point of navigation, and the culmination of his experience. It seemed to throw a kind of light on everything around him and into his thoughts, somber, pitiful, not extraordinary, not very clear, and yet it threw a kind of light. He reminded them he had just returned to London after a lot of Indian Ocean, Pacific China Seas, 6 years or so of the East, and he had been loafing about, hindering them in their work and invading their homes, as if on a heavenly mission to civilize them. It was fine for a time, but then he grew tired of resting. He began to look for a ship, the hardest work on earth, and the ships wouldn't even look at him. He got tired of that game too. As a little chap, he had a passion for maps. He would look for hours at South America, Africa, or Australia, losing himself in the glories of exploration. There were many blank spaces on the earth then. When he saw one that looked particularly inviting on a map, they all did, he would put his finger on it and say that when he grew up, he would go there. The North Pole was one such place. He hadn't been there yet and wouldn't try now. The glamour was off. Other places were scattered around the equator and every latitude across both hemispheres. He had been in some of them, and they wouldn't talk about that. But there was one yet the biggest, the most blank, so to speak, that he had a hankering after. By then, the map was no blank space. Rivers, lakes, and names had filled it since his boyhood. Gone was the delightful mystery, the white patch for glorious dreaming. It had become a place of darkness. But one river especially caught his eye on the map, a mighty thing like an immense uncoiled snake, head in the sea, body curving over a vast country, tail lost deep inland. Seeing it in a shop window, it fascinated him, the way a snake fascinates a silly little bird. Then he recalled there was a trading company on that river. They couldn't trade without steamboats on all that fresh water. Why shouldn't he try to get command of one? He walked on along Fleet Street, but couldn't shake the idea. The snake had charmed him. It was a continental concern. He had many relations living on the continent, cheap there, and not as nasty as it looked, they said. He began to worry them for help. A fresh departure for him. He always went his own road on his own legs. He wouldn't have believed it of himself, but he felt he must get there by hook or crook. The men said, "My dear fellow," and did nothing. So he tried the women. Charlie Marlowe set the women to work to get a job. The notion drove him. His aunt, a dear, enthusiastic soul, wrote that she was ready to do anything. It was a glorious idea. She knew the wife of a very high personage in the administration, and a man with lots of influence. She was determined to make no end of fuss to get him appointed skipper of a river steamboat. He got his appointment, and very quick. The company had received news that one of their captains had been killed in a scuffle with natives. That was his chance, and it made him the more anxious to go. Only months later, when he tried to recover what was left of the body, did he learn the original quarrel arose from a misunderstanding about 2 black hens. The fellow's name was Fres Levenadane. He thought himself wronged in the bargain, went ashore, and started hammering the village chief with a stick. It didn't surprise Marlowe to hear this, and at the same time, that Fresleven was the gentlest creature who ever walked on 2 legs. He'd been out there a couple of years in the noble cause, and probably felt the need to assert his self-respect. So he whacked the old man mercilessly while the crowd watched, thunderstruck, until someone, the chief's son, made a tentative jab with a spear at the white man. It went easy between the shoulder blades. Then the whole population fled into the forest, expecting calamities, while Fresleven's steamer left in a panic. Nobody troubled much about the remains until Marlowe stepped into his shoes. He couldn't let it rest, but when an opportunity finally came to meet his predecessor, grass growing through his ribs was tall enough to hide the bones. The village was deserted, huts gaping black and rotting, enclosures fallen. Mad terror had scattered everyone, men, women, children, through the bush, never to return. What became of the hens he didn't know. The cause of progress got them, he supposed. Through this glorious affair he got his appointment before he'd fairly begun to hope for it. He flew around like mad to get ready, and within 48 hours crossed the channel to show himself to his employers and sign the contract. He arrived in a city that always made him think of a whited sepulchre prejudice, no doubt. He found the company's offices easily. It was the biggest thing in town, and everyone he met was full of it. They were going to run an overseas empire and make endless coin by trade. A narrow, deserted street in deep shadow. High houses, innumerable shuttered windows, dead silence, grass sprouting between stones, imposing carriage archways, immense double doors standing ponderously ajar. He slipped through a crack, went up a swept, ungarnished staircase arid as a desert, and opened the first door. 2 women, One fat, one slim sat on straw-bottomed chairs, knitting black wool. The slim one rose and walked straight at him, still knitting with downcast eyes. Just as he began thinking of getting out of her way as for a somnambulist, she stood still and looked up. Her dress was plain as an umbrella cover. She turned without a word and led him into a waiting room. He gave his name and looked about. A deal table in the middle, plain chairs along the walls, and on one end, a large shining map marked with rainbow colors. Vast amounts of red good to see, because real work was done there. Plenty of blue, a little green, smears of orange, and on the east coast a purple patch showing where the jolly pioneers of progress drank jolly lager beer. He wasn't going into any of those. He was going into the yellow, dead in the center, and the river was there fascinating, deadly like a snake. A door opened. A white-haired secretarial head appeared, wearing a compassionate expression, and a skinny forefinger beckoned him into a dim sanctuary. A heavy writing desk squatted in the middle. Behind it came an impression of pale plumpness in a frock coat. The great man himself, about 5'6", with his grip on the handle end of many millions. He shook hands, murmured vaguely, was satisfied with Marlowe's French. Bon voyage. 45 seconds later, he was back in the waiting room with a compassionate secretary who, full of desolation and sympathy, made him sign a document. Among other things, he undertook not to disclose any trade secrets. Well, he wasn't going to. He began to feel slightly uneasy, not used to such ceremonies, and there was something ominous in the atmosphere, as though he'd been led into some conspiracy, something not quite right. He was glad to get out. In the outer room, the two women knitted black wool feverishly. People were arriving. The younger one walked back and forth, introducing them. The old one sat on her chair. Flat cloth slippers propped on a foot warmer, a cat on her lap, a starched white thing on her head, a wart on one cheek, silver-rimmed spectacles on the tip of her nose. She glanced at him above the glasses. The swift, indifferent placidity of that look troubled him. Two youths with foolish, cheery faces were piloted over, and she threw them the same quick glance of unconcerned wisdom. She seemed to know all about them, and about him too. An eerie feeling came over him. She seemed uncanny and fateful. Often far away he thought of these two, guarding the door of darkness, knitting black wool as for a warm pall, one introducing endlessly to the unknown, the other scrutinizing faces with unconcerned old eyes. Not many she looked at ever saw her again, not half, by a long way. There was yet a visit to the doctor. A simple formality, the secretary assured him. A young clerk wearing his hat over his left eyebrow, shabby, careless, ink stains on his sleeves, cravat large under a chin shaped like an old boot's toe, led him forth. Too early for the doctor, so Marlowe proposed a drink. Over vermouths, the clerk glorified the company's business. Marlowe expressed surprise at him not going out there. The clerk became very cool and collected. He said he wasn't such a fool as he looked, emptied his glass with great resolution, and they rose. The old doctor felt his pulse, evidently thinking of something else. He mumbled that it was good for there, then asked with eagerness whether he could measure Marlowe's head. Surprised, Marlowe said yes. The doctor produced calipers, got dimensions front and back and every way, taking careful notes. An unshaven little man in a threadbare coat like a gabardine, feet in slippers. Marlowe thought him a harmless fool. The doctor said he always asked leave, in the interests of science, to measure the crania of those going out there. When Marlowe asked whether he measured them coming back too, the doctor remarked he never saw them. The changes took place inside, you know. He smiled at some quiet joke, gave Marlowe a searching glance, made another note, then asked in a matter-of-fact tone whether there had ever been any madness in his family. Annoyed, Marlowe asked if that question was also in the interests of science. The doctor said it would be interesting for science to watch the mental changes of individuals on the spot. Marlowe interrupted, asking if he was an alienist. Every doctor should be a little, the man replied imperturbably. He had a little theory. The gentleman who went out there must help improve his share in the advantages his country would reap from such a magnificent dependency. the mere wealth he left to others. He apologized for his questions, noting Marlowe was the first Englishman under his observation. Marlowe hastened to assure him he wasn't in the least typical. If he were, he wouldn't be talking like this. The doctor called that rather profound and probably erroneous, then advised avoiding irritation more than exposure to the sun. In the tropics, one must keep calm. He lifted a warning forefinger and said, "Du calme, adieu." One thing remained: goodbye to his excellent aunt. He found her triumphant. Over tea in a soothing drawing-room, they had a long, quiet chat by the fireside. During their confidences, it became plain to him that he had been represented to the wife of a high dignitary, and goodness knows how many others, as an exceptional gifted creature, a piece of good fortune for the company, a man you don't get hold of every day. Good heavens! And he was going to take charge of a 2-pence halfpenny river steamboat, with a penny whistle attached. Apparently he was also one of the workers with a capital letter, something like an emissary of light, a lower sort of apostle. Much such rot had been loose in print and talk just then, and his excellent aunt, living right in the rush of all that humbug, got carried away. She talked about weaning those ignorant millions from their horrid ways until she made him quite uncomfortable. He ventured to hint that the company was run for profit. She replied brightly that he forgot the laborer was worthy of his hire. It was queer how out of touch with truth women were. They lived in a world of their own, too beautiful altogether, and if they ever set it up, it would go to pieces before the first sunset. Some confounded fact men had lived with contentedly since creation would start up and knock the whole thing over. After embraces, instructions to wear flannel and write often, he left. In the street, a queer feeling came to him that he was an imposter. Odd, he who used to clear out for any part of the world at 24 hours' notice, with less thought than most men gave to crossing a street, had a moment of startled pause before this commonplace affair. For a second or two, he felt as though, instead of going to the center of a continent, he were about to set off for the center of the earth. He left on a French steamer that called at every port along the coast, seemingly just to land soldiers and customs officers. Watching the coast slip by felt like contemplating an enigma, smiling, frowning, inviting, savage, always mute, yet whispering for someone to come and find out. This one was almost featureless, monotonously grim, with the edge of a colossal jungle so dark green it was nearly black, fringed with white surf, running straight along a blue sea whose glitter blurred under creeping mist. The sun was fierce, the land glistened and dripped with steam. Here and there grayish specks appeared inside the surf, maybe with a flag above them, settlements centuries old, still no bigger than pinheads on the untouched expanse. They pounded along, stopped, landed soldiers, went on, landed customs clerks to collect tolls in what looked like a god-forsaken wilderness with a tin shed and flagpole. Then more soldiers, presumably, to protect the clerks. Some drowned in the surf, he heard, but nobody seemed to care. They were flung out there, and on they went. Every day the coast looked the same, as though they hadn't moved. They passed trading places with farcical names, Grand Bassam, little pawpaw names belonging to some sordid farce against a sinister backdrop. The idleness of a passenger, his isolation among men he had no connection with, the oily, languid sea, the uniform somberness of the coast, all seemed to keep him from the truth, trapped in a mournful, senseless delusion. The surf's voice was a positive pleasure when heard, natural and meaningful like a brother's speech. Now and then a boat from shore gave momentary contact with reality, paddled by blackfellows. From afar he could see the white of their eyeballs glistening. They shouted, sang, bodies streaming sweat, faces like grotesque masks, but they had bone, muscle, wild vitality, intense energy of movement as natural and true as the surf. They needed no excuse for being there. Looking at them was a great comfort for a time. He felt he still belonged to a world of straightforward facts. But it never lasted. Something always scared it away. Once they came upon a man-of-war anchored off the coast. No shed anywhere. She was shelling the bush. The French had one of their wars going on thereabouts. Her ensign drooped like a rag. Long 8-inch gun muzzles stuck out over the low hull, The greasy swell swung her up and down lazily, swaying her thin masts. In the empty immensity of earth, sky, and water, there she was, incomprehensible, firing into a continent. A gun would go pop, a small flame dart and vanish, a little white smoke disappear, a tiny projectile give a feeble screech, and nothing happened. Nothing could happen. There was insanity in the proceeding, a lugubrious drollery, not dispelled by someone on board earnestly assuring him there was a camp of natives' enemies. He called them hidden somewhere out of sight. They delivered letters. He heard men on that lonely ship were dying of fever at 3 a day, and went on. They called at more places with farcical names, where the merry dance of death and trade continued in a still, earthy atmosphere like an overheated catacomb, all along the formless coast bordered by dangerous surf, as if nature herself tried to ward off intruders. In and out of rivers, streams of death and life, banks rotting into mud, waters thickening into slime, invading contorted mangroves that seemed to writhe at them in impotent despair. Nowhere did they stop long enough for a particularized impression, but the general sense of vague, oppressive wonder grew upon him. It was like a weary pilgrimage amongst hints for nightmares. Upwards of 30 days passed before he saw the big river's mouth. They anchored off the seat of government, but his work wouldn't begin until 200 miles further on, so as soon as he could, he started for a place 30 miles up. He took passage on a little sea-going steamer whose captain was a Swede. Recognizing a fellow seaman, the captain invited him to the bridge, a young, lean, fair, morose man with lanky hair and a shuffling gait. As they left the miserable little wharf, the captain tossed his head contemptuously at the shore and asked if he'd been living there. Marlowe said yes. The captain then remarked bitterly, with precise English, what a fine lot those government chaps were. Funny, what some people would do for a few francs a month. He wondered what became of that kind when they went up country. Marlowe expected to see that soon. The captain shuffled athwart, keeping one eye ahead, and warned him not to be too sure. He'd recently taken up a man who hanged himself on the road, a Swede too. Marlowe cried out in God's name. Why? The captain kept watching ahead, and said who knew the sun too much for him, or the country perhaps. They opened to reach. A rocky cliff appeared, mounds of turned-up earth by the shore, houses on a hill, others with iron roofs amongst a waste of excavations, or hanging to the declivity. A continuous noise of rapids above hovered over this scene of inhabited devastation. Many people, mostly black and naked, moved about like ants. A jetty projected into the river. Blinding sunlight drowned everything at times in a sudden recrudescence of glare. The Swede pointed to 3 wooden barrack-like structures on the rocky slope. That was the company's station. He would send Marlowe's things up. 4 boxes? So, farewell. He came upon a boiler wallowing in the grass, then found a path up the hill. It turned aside for boulders, and for an undersized railway truck lying on its back with wheels in the air, one wheel off. The thing looked as dead as an animal's carcass. He found more decaying machinery, a stack of rusty rails. To the left, a clump of trees made thick shade where dark things seemed to stir feebly. He blinked. The path was steep. A horn tooted to the right. He saw black people run. A heavy, dull detonation shook the ground. A puff of smoke came out of the cliff, and that was all. No change appeared on the rock's face. They were building a railway. The cliff wasn't in the way of anything, but this objectless blasting was all the work going on. A slight clinking behind him made him turn. 6 black men advanced in a file, toiling up the path, walking erect and slow, balancing small baskets of earth on their heads. The clink kept time with their footsteps. Black rags wound round their loins, the short ends wagging behind like tails. He could see every rib. The joints of their limbs were like knots in a rope. Each had an iron collar on his neck, and all were connected by a chain whose bites swung between them, rhythmically clinking. Another report from the cliff made him think suddenly of that warship firing into a continent, the same kind of ominous voice. But these men could not by any stretch be called enemies. They were called criminals, and the outraged law, like bursting shells, had come to them as an insoluble mystery from over the sea. All their meager breasts panted together, Violently dilated nostrils quivered, eyes stared stonily uphill. They passed within 6 inches without a glance, with the complete death-like indifference of unhappy savages. Behind them, one of the reclaimed, the product of new forces at work, strolled despondently, carrying a rifle by its middle. He had a uniform jacket with one button off. Seeing a white man on the path, he hoisted his weapon to his shoulder with alacrity, simple prudence. Since white men looked so alike at a distance, he couldn't tell who Marlowe might be. Reassured quickly, he gave a large, white, rascally grin and a glance at his charge, seeming to take Marlowe into partnership in his exalted trust. After all, Marlowe also was part of the great cause of these high and just proceedings. Instead of going up, he turned and descended left, wanting the chain gang out of sight before he climbed. He wasn't particularly tender. He'd had to strike and fend off, resist and attack sometimes, without counting the exact cost according to the demands of the life he'd blundered into. He'd seen the devil of violence, the devil of greed, the devil of hot desire, strong, lusty, red-eyed devils that swayed and drove men. But standing on that hillside under the blinding sunshine, he foresaw he would become acquainted with a flabby, pretending, weak-eyed devil of rapacious and pitiless folly. How insidious that devil could be, he would only find out months later and 1,000 miles further. For a moment, he stood appalled, as if by a warning. Then he descended obliquely toward the trees. He avoided a vast artificial hole someone had been digging on the slope, its purpose impossible to divine, not a quarry or sand pit, just a hole. It might have been connected with the philanthropic desire to give the criminals something to do. He didn't know. He nearly fell into a very narrow ravine, little more than a scar in the hillside, where a lot of imported drainage pipes for the settlement had been tumbled and every one broken. A wanton smash-up. At last he got under the trees, intending to stroll into the shade for a moment. But no sooner inside than he felt he'd stepped into the gloomy circle of some inferno. The rapids were near, and uninterrupted, headlong rushing noise filled the mournful stillness of the grove, where not a breath stirred, not a leaf moved, a mysterious sound, as though the tearing pace of the launched earth had suddenly become audible. Black shapes crouched, sat between the trees, leaning against trunks, clinging to the earth, half emerging, half effaced in the dim light, in all the attitudes of pain, abandonment, and despair. Another mine went off on the cliff, followed by a slight shudder of the soil under his feet. The work was going on. The work! And this was where some of the helpers had withdrawn to die. They were dying slowly, that was very clear. Not enemies, not criminals, nothing earthly now, just black shadows of disease and starvation lying confusedly in the greenish gloom. Brought from all recesses of the coast under legal time, contracts, lost in uncongenial surroundings, fed unfamiliar food, they sickened, became inefficient, and were then allowed to crawl away and rest. These moribund shapes were free as air and nearly as thin. He began distinguishing the gleam of eyes under the trees. Glancing down, he saw a face near his hand. The black bones reclined full length, one shoulder against a tree. Slowly, the eyelids rose, sunken eyes looked up at him, enormous and vacant, a kind of blind white flicker in the depths that died out slowly. The man seemed young, almost a boy, though with them it was hard to tell. Finding nothing else to do, Marlowe offered him one of the Swede ship's biscuits from his pocket. The fingers closed slowly on it and held no other movement, no other glance. A bit of white worsted was tied round his neck. Why? Where did he get it? A badge, an ornament, a charm, a propitiatory act. Was there any idea at all connected with it? It looked startling around that black neck, this bit of white thread from beyond the seas. Near the same tree, 2 more bundles of acute angles sat with legs drawn up. One, chin propped on knees, stared at nothing in an intolerable, appalling manner. His brother phantom rested its forehead, as if overcome with great weariness. All about, others were scattered in every pose of contorted collapse, like some picture of a massacre or pestilence. While Marlowe stood horror-struck, one of these creatures rose to hands and knees and went off on all fours toward the river to drink. He lapped out of his hand, then sat up in the sunlight, crossing his shins, and after a time let his woolly head fall onto his breastbone. He didn't want any more loitering in the shade and made haste toward the station. Near the buildings, he met a white man in such unexpected elegance that for a first moment he took him for a vision. A high starched collar, white cuffs, a light alpaca jacket, snowy trousers, a clear silk necktie, varnished boots, no hat, hair parted, brushed, oiled, under a green-lined parasol held in a big white hand. Amazing, a penholder behind his ear. Marlowe shook hands with this miracle, and learned he was the company's chief accountant. All bookkeeping was done at this station. He had come out for a moment, he said, to get a breath of fresh air. The expression sounded wonderfully odd, suggesting sedentary desk life. Marlowe wouldn't have mentioned him at all, except that from his lips he first heard the name of the man indissolubly connected with those memories. Moreover, Marlowe respected him, respected his collars, his vast cuffs, his brushed head. His appearance was that of a hairdresser's dummy, but in the great demoralization of the land he kept up his appearance. That was backbone. His starched collars and shirt fronts were achievements of character. He had been out nearly 3 years. Later, Marlowe couldn't help asking how he managed to sport such linen. The man blushed faintly and said modestly that he had been teaching one of the native women at the station. Difficult, since she had a distaste for the work. So this man had verily accomplished something, and he was devoted to his books, which were in apple pie order. Everything else in the station was a muddle heads, things, buildings. Caravans of dusty natives with splay feet arrived, and departed a stream of manufactured goods. Rubbishy cottons, beads, brass wire set off into the depths of darkness, and in return came a precious trickle of ivory. Marlowe had to wait 10 days an eternity. He lived in a tent in the yard, but to escape the chaos he would sometimes get into the accountant's office, built of horizontal planks so badly put together that as the accountant bent over his high desk, he was barred from neck to heels with narrow strips of sunlight. No need to open the shutter to see. It was hot there. 2 big flies buzzed fiendishly, not stinging but stabbing. Marlowe sat on the floor while the accountant, faultless and even slightly scented, perched on a high stool and wrote. Sometimes he stood for exercise. When a truckle bed with a sick man, some invalided agent from up-country, was hurriedly put in there, he exhibited gentle annoyance, saying the sick person's groans distracted his attention, and without that, it was extremely difficult to guard against clerical errors in this climate. One day, without lifting his head, he remarked that in the interior Marlowe would no doubt meet Mr. Kurtz. When Marlowe asked who Mr. Kurtz was, the accountant said he was a first-class agent. Seeing Marlowe's disappointment at this thin information, he laid down his pen and added slowly that Kurtz was a very remarkable person. Further questions revealed that Kurtz was currently in charge of a very important trading post in the true ivory country, at the very bottom of there. He sent in as much ivory as all the others put together. He began writing again. The sick man was too ill to groan. The flies buzzed in great peace. Suddenly, a growing murmur of voices and great tramping of feet. A caravan had come in. A violent babble of uncouth sounds burst out on the other side of the planks. All the carriers were speaking together, and in the uproar, the lamentable voice of the chief agent was heard tearfully giving it up for the 20th time that day. The accountant rose slowly, remarking, "What a frightful row." He crossed the room gently to look at the sick man, then returned to say that he didn't hear. Startled, Marlowe asked if he was dead. Not yet. The accountant answered with great composure. Then, tossing his head toward the tumult in the yard, he said that when one had to make correct entries, one came to hate these savages, hate them to the death. After a thoughtful moment, he told Marlowe that when he saw Mr. Kurtz, he should tell him from the accountant that everything here, he glanced at the desk, was very satisfactory. He didn't like to write with those messengers one never knew who might get hold of a letter at the central station. He stared at Marlowe with mild, bulging eyes, then said Kurtz would go far, very far, as somebody in the administration before long. The council in Europe meant him to be. He turned back to his work. The noise outside ceased. As Marlowe left, He stopped at the door. In the steady buzz of flies, the homeward-bound agent lay flushed and insensible. The other, bent over his books, made correct entries of perfectly correct transactions, and 50 feet below the doorstep, he could see the still treetops of the Grove of Death. Next day he left that station at last, with a caravan of 60 men, for a 200-mile tramp. No use telling much about that. Paths everywhere, stamped in networks spreading over empty land, through long grass, burnt grass, thickets, down and up chilly ravines, up and down stony hills ablaze with heat. A solitude, nobody, not a hut. The population had cleared out long ago. If a lot of mysterious natives, armed with fearful weapons, suddenly took to traveling between Deal and Gravesend, catching yokels to carry heavy loads, every farm and cottage thereabouts would empty very soon. Only here the dwellings were gone too. He passed several abandoned villages, something pathetically childish in the ruins of grass walls. Day after day the stamp and shuffle of 60 bare feet behind him, each pair under a 60-pound load. Camp, cook, sleep, strike camp, march. Now and then a carrier dead in harness, at rest in the long grass near the path, an empty water gourd, and long staff lying by his side. A great silence around and above. On some quiet night, the tremor of far-off drums sinking, swelling, a vast, faint tremor, a sound weird, appealing, suggestive, wild, with perhaps as profound a meaning as the sound of bells in a Christian country. Once a white man in an unbuttoned uniform, camping on the path with an armed escort of lank Zanzibaris, very hospitable and festive, not to say drunk. He declared he was looking after the upkeep of the road. Marlowe couldn't say he saw any road or any upkeep, unless the body of a middle-aged Negro with a bullet hole in the forehead, which he absolutely stumbled upon 3 miles further on, could be considered a permanent improvement. He had a white companion too, not a bad chap, but rather too fleshy, with the exasperating habit of fainting on hot hillsides, miles from shade or water. Annoying to hold one's own coat like a parasol over a man's head while he was coming to. Marlowe once asked him what he meant by coming there at all. He answered scornfully that he came to make money, of course. What else did Marlowe think? Then he got fever, and had to be carried in a hammock slung under a pole. Weighing 16 stone, he caused endless rows with the carriers. They jibbed, ran away, sneaked off with their loads at night, quite a mutiny. So one evening Marlowe made a speech in English with gestures, not one lost on the 60 pairs of eyes before him, and the next morning started the hammock off in front all right. An hour later, he came upon the whole concern wrecked in a bushman. Hammock, groans, blankets, horrors. The heavy pole had skinned the poor man's nose. He was very anxious for Marlowe to kill somebody, but there wasn't the shadow of a carrier near. Marlowe remembered the old doctor. It would be interesting for science to watch the mental changes of individuals on the spot. He felt he was becoming scientifically interesting. However, all that to no purpose. On the 15th day, he came in sight of the big river again and hobbled into the central station. It was on a backwater surrounded by scrub and forest, with a pretty border of smelly mud on one side, and on the other 3 enclosed by a crazy fence of rushes. A neglected gap was all the gate it had. The first glance at the place was enough to see that the flabby devil was running that show. White men with long staves appeared languidly from among the buildings, strolling up to look at him, then retiring out of sight. One of them, a stout, excitable chap with black mustaches, informed him with great volubility and many digressions, as soon as Marlowe said who he was, that his steamer was at the bottom of the river. Thunderstruck. What? How? Why? Oh, it was all right. The manager himself was there. All quite correct. Everybody had behaved splendidly. Splendidly. The man said in agitation that Marlowe must go and see the general manager at once. He was waiting. Marlowe did not see the real significance of that wreck at once. He fancied he saw it now, but wasn't sure, not at all. The affair was too stupid, when he thought of it, to be altogether natural. Still, but at the moment it presented itself simply as a confounded nuisance. The steamer was sunk. They had started 2 days before in a sudden hurry up the river with the manager on board, in charge of some volunteer skipper, and before 3 hours had torn the bottom out on stones, sinking near the south bank. He asked himself what he was to do there now that his boat was lost. As a matter of fact, he had plenty to do, and fishing his command out of the river had to set about it the very next day. That and the repairs when he brought the pieces to the station took some months. His first interview with the manager was curious. The manager did not ask him to sit down after his 20-mile walk that morning. He was commonplace in complexion, feature, manner, voice middle size, ordinary build. His eyes, of the usual blue, were perhaps remarkably cold, and he could certainly make his glance fall as trenchant and heavy as an axe. But even then the rest of his person seemed to disclaim the intention. Otherwise there was only an indefinable faint expression of his lips, something stealthy, a smile, not a smile. Marlowe remembered it but couldn't explain. It was unconscious. Though just after he said something it intensified for an instant. It came at the end of his speeches like a seal applied to words, making the commonest phrase appear absolutely inscrutable. He was a common trader, from youth employed in these parts, nothing more. He was obeyed, yet inspired neither love nor fear, nor even respect. He inspired uneasiness. That was it. Uneasiness, not definite mistrust, just uneasiness. Marlowe had no idea how effective such a faculty could be. The manager had no genius for organizing, for initiative, or even for order evident in the deplorable state of the station. He had no learning, no intelligence. His position had come to him. Why? Perhaps because he was never ill. He had served 3 terms of 3 years out there. Triumphant health in the general rout of constitutions is a kind of power in itself. When he went home on leave, he rioted on a large scale pompously. Jack ashore with a difference, only in externals. One could gather this from his casual talk. He originated nothing. He could keep the routine going, that's all. But he was great by this little thing. It was impossible to tell what could control such a man. He never gave that secret away. Perhaps there was nothing within him. Such a suspicion made one pause, for out there were no external checks. Once, when various tropical diseases had laid low almost every agent in the station, he was heard to say that men who came out here should have no entrails. He sealed the utterance with that smile, as though it were a door opening into a darkness he had in his keeping. You fancied you had seen things, but the seal was on. When annoyed at mealtimes by constant quarrels among white men about precedence, he ordered an immense round table to be made, for which a special house had to be built. This became the station's mess room. Where he sat was the first place, the rest were nowhere. One felt this was his unalterable conviction. He was neither civil nor uncivil. He was quiet. He allowed his boy, an overfed young Negro from the coast, to treat the white men under his very eyes with provoking insolence. The manager began speaking as soon as he saw Marlowe. He couldn't wait, had to start without him. The upriver stations needed relief, too many delays. Already he didn't know who was dead or alive. He paid no attention to Marlowe's explanations, playing with a stick of sealing wax, and repeating that the situation was very grave. Rumor said a very important station was in jeopardy and its chief, Mr. Kurtz, was ill. He hoped it wasn't true. Marlowe, weary and irritable, thought to himself that Kurtz could go hang. He interrupted to say he had heard of Kurtz on the coast. The manager murmured that they talked of him down there, then resumed that Kurtz was his best agent, exceptional, of the greatest importance. So Marlowe could understand his anxiety. He was very, very uneasy. He fidgeted, exclaimed, "Ah, Mr. Kurtz," broke the sealing wax, and seemed dumbfounded by the accident. Next he wanted to know how long it would take. Marlowe, hungry, kept on his feet, growing savage, said he couldn't tell, he hadn't even seen the wreck yet. Some months, no doubt. All this talk seemed futile. The manager said 3 months before they could start, and that ought to do the affair. Marlowe flung out of his clay hut, muttering his opinion that he was a chattering idiot. Later he took it back, when it bore upon him startlingly with what extreme nicety the manager had estimated the time. He went to work the next day, turning his back on that station. Only that way could he keep his hold on the redeeming facts of life. Still, one had to look about sometimes, and then he saw this station. These men strolling aimlessly in the sunshine with their absurd long staves, like faithless pilgrims bewitched inside a rotten fence. The word ivory rang in the air, whispered, sighed. One would think they were praying to it. A taint of imbecile rapacity blew through it all like a whiff from some corpse. He'd never seen anything so unreal. And outside, the silent wilderness surrounding this cleared speck struck him as something great and invincible, like evil or truth, waiting patiently for this fantastic invasion to pass away. Various things happened. One evening a grass shed full of calico, cotton prints, beads, and other goods burst into a blaze so suddenly that one would think the earth had opened to let avenging fire consume all that trash. Marlowe was smoking by his dismantled steamer, watching them cut capers in the light with arms lifted high, when a stout man with mustaches came tearing down with a tin pail, assuring him everybody was behaving splendidly, dipped out about a quart of water, and tore back with a hole in the bottom of his pail. Marlowe strolled up. No hurry. The thing had gone off like a box of matches, hopeless from the first. The flame leaped high, drove everyone back, lit up everything, then collapsed. The shed became a heap of fiercely glowing embers. Nearby, a native was being beaten, said to have caused the fire. He was screeching horribly. For several days afterward, Marlowe saw him sitting in some shade, very sick, trying to recover. Then he arose and went out, and the wilderness, without a sound, took him back. Approaching the glow from the dark, Marlowe found himself behind two men talking. He heard Kurtz's name, then the words, "Take advantage of this unfortunate accident." One was the manager. Marlowe wished him a good evening. The manager said it was incredible and walked off. The other remained a first-class agent, young, gentlemanly, reserved, with a forked beard and hooked nose. Standoffish with the others. They said he was the manager's spy. Marlowe had hardly spoken to him before. They got into talk, strolled away from the hissing ruins, and he invited Marlowe to his room in the main building. He struck a match. Marlowe saw that this young aristocrat had not only a silver-mounted dressing case, but a whole candle to himself at a time when the manager was the only one supposed to have any right to candles. Native mats covered clay walls. A collection of spears, assegais, shields, knives hung as trophies. This fellow's business was making bricks, so Marlowe had been informed. But there wasn't a brick fragment anywhere in the station, and he'd been there over a year, waiting. He couldn't make bricks without something straw, maybe which couldn't be found there, nor likely sent from Europe. So what was he waiting for? An act of special creation, perhaps, but they were all waiting, all 16 or 20 pilgrims, for something. It didn't seem an uncongenial occupation, though the only thing that ever came to them was disease. They beguiled time by backbiting and intriguing foolishly. An air of plotting hung about the station, but nothing came of it. It was as unreal as everything else. The philanthropic pretense of the whole concern, their talk, their government, their show of work. The only real feeling was the desire to get appointed to a trading post where ivory could be had, to earn percentages. They intrigued, slandered, hated each other only on that account, but as to lifting a finger, no. Marlowe had no idea why the fellow wanted to be so sociable, until it occurred to him that he was being pumped. The man alluded constantly to Europe, to people Marlowe was supposed to know, putting leading questions about his acquaintances in the sepulchral city. His little eyes glittered with curiosity, though he tried to keep up a supercilious air. Marlowe became awfully curious to see what he would find out. It was pretty to see how he baffled himself. Marlowe's body was full of chills, his head full only of the steamboat business. Evidently the man took him for a shameless prevaricator. At last, he got angry, yawned to conceal furious annoyance. Marlowe rose. Then he noticed a small oil sketch on a panel, a draped, blindfolded woman carrying a lighted torch against a somber, nearly black background. The movement was stately, the torchlight on her face sinister. It arrested him. The man stood by civilly, holding an empty half-pint champagne bottle with the candle stuck in it. Marlowe asked, and he said Kurtz had painted this in this very station over a year ago, while waiting to go to his trading post. Marlowe then asked who this Mr. Kurtz was. The man answered shortly, looking away, that he was the chief of the inner station. Marlowe laughed, and said the man was the brickmaker of the central station. Everyone knew that. After a silence, the man said Kurtz was a prodigy, an emissary of pity, science, progress, and devil knows what else. They wanted, he declaimed, for the guidance of the cause entrusted to them by Europe, higher intelligence, wide sympathies, a singleness of purpose. Marlowe asked, "Who said that?" "Lots of them," he replied. "Some even wrote it. So Kurtz came here as a special being, as Marlowe ought to know." "Why ought he to know?" Marlowe interrupted, surprised. The man paid no attention. "Today Kurtz was chief of the best station next year, assistant manager 2 years more, but Marlowe knew what he would be in 2 years. Marlowe was of the new gang, the gang of virtue. The same people who sent Kurtz specially had recommended Marlowe. Light dawned on Marlowe. His dear aunt's influential acquaintances were producing an unexpected effect. He nearly burst out laughing, and asked severely whether the man read the company's confidential correspondence. The man had nothing to say. Great fun. Marlowe continued that when Kurtz was general manager, he wouldn't have the opportunity. The man blew out the candle, and they went outside. The moon had risen. Black figures strolled listlessly, pouring water on the glow, steam ascending in the moonlight. The beaten native groaned somewhere. The indefatigable man with mustaches appeared, calling the brute's woe pitiless, and saying this would prevent future conflagrations, transgression, punishment. Bang! He noticed Marlowe's companion and became crestfallen, said something servile about danger and agitation, then vanished. Marlowe went to the riverside, the other following, murmuring a scathing comment about a heap of muffs. Pilgrims stood in knots gesticulating, many still holding their staves. Marlowe believed they took them to bed. Beyond the fence, the forest stood spectrally in moonlight. Through the dim stir of that lamentable courtyard, the silence of the land went home to one's very heart. Its mystery, its greatness, the amazing reality of its concealed life. The hurt native moaned feebly, then fetched a deep sigh that made Marlowe mend his pace. He felt a hand under his arm. The fellow said he didn't want to be misunderstood, especially by Marlowe, who would see Kurtz long before he could. He wouldn't like Kurtz to get a false idea of his disposition. Marlowe let this papier-mâché Mephistopheles run on. The man had been planning to be assistant manager under the present one, and Kurtz's coming had upset them both. He talked precipitately. Marlowe had his shoulders against the wreck of his steamer, hauled up like a carcass. The smell of primeval mud filled his nostrils, the high stillness of primeval forests before his eyes, shiny patches on the black creek. The moon spread a thin layer of silver over rank grass, mud, the wall of matted vegetation higher than a temple, over the great river glittering through a somber gap as it flowed broadly without a murmur. All this was great, expectant, mute, while the man jabbered about himself. Marlowe wondered whether the stillness of the immensity looking at them was an appeal or a menace. Could they handle that dumb thing? Or would it handle them? He felt how big that thing was that couldn't talk and might be deaf. What was in there? He could see a little ivory coming out, and had heard Kurtz was in there. He'd heard enough about it to, God knows, yet it brought no image with it, no more than if he'd been told an angel or fiend was in there. He believed it the same way one might believe there are inhabitants on Mars. He wouldn't have gone so far as to fight for Kurtz, but he went near enough to a lie. He hated lies, not because he was straighter than the rest, but because they appalled him. A taint of death, a flavor of mortality in lies, exactly what he hated and detested in the world, what he wanted to forget. It made him miserable and sick, like biting something rotten. He went near enough to it by letting that young fool believe anything he liked about Marlowe's influence in Europe. He became in an instant as much a pretense as the rest, simply because he had a notion it might help that Kurtz, whom at the time he did not see just a word. He did not see the man in the name any more than his listeners did. Did they see him? Did they see the story? Did they see anything? It seemed to him he was trying to tell a dream, a vain attempt, because no relation of a dream can convey the dream sensation, that commingling of absurdity, surprise, and bewilderment in a tremor of struggling revolt, that notion of being captured by the incredible, which is the very essence of dreams. He was silent for a while. No, impossible, impossible to convey the life sensation of any given epoch of one's existence, that which makes its truth, its meaning, its subtle and penetrating essence. Impossible. We live, as we dream alone. He paused again, then added that in this they saw more than he could then. They saw him, whom they knew. It had become pitch dark. For a long time he, sitting apart, had been no more than a voice. No one spoke. The others might have been asleep, but the listener was awake, listening, on the watch for the sentence, the word that would give the clue to the faint uneasiness inspired by this narrative, shaping itself without human lips in the heavy night air of the river. Marlowe let him run on, thinking what he pleased about the powers behind him. There was nothing behind him, nothing but that wretched, mangled steamboat he leaned against while the man talked fluently about the necessity for every man to get on. Out here, one didn't come to gaze at the moon. Kurtz was a universal genius, but even a genius would find it easier to work with adequate tools, intelligent men. He didn't make bricks because of physical impossibility, as Marlowe well knew, and if he did secretarial work for the manager, it was because no sensible man wantonly rejected the confidence of his superiors. Did Marlowe see it? He saw it. What he really wanted was rivets. Rivets. To get on with the work to stop the hole. Cases of them were down at the coast, piled up, burst, split. You kicked a loose rivet every second step in that station yard. Rivets had rolled into the grove of death. You could fill your pockets with them for the trouble of stooping, and not one rivet where it was wanted. They had plates that would do, but nothing to fasten them with. Every week the messenger left for the coast several times a week. A caravan came in with trade goods, ghastly calico, glass beads, spotted handkerchiefs, and no rivets. 3 carriers could have brought all that was needed. The man was becoming confidential, but Marlowe's unresponsive attitude must have exasperated him at last, for he judged it necessary to inform Marlowe that he feared neither God nor devil, let alone any mere man. Marlowe could see that very well, but what he wanted was a certain quantity of rivets, and rivets were what Kurtz really wanted, if only he knew it. Now letters went to the coast every week. The man cried that he wrote from dictation. Marlowe demanded rivets. There was a way for an intelligent man. The man changed his manner, became very cold, and began to talk about a hippopotamus, wondered whether sleeping on the steamer disturbed Marlowe. An old hippo had the bad habit of getting out on the bank at night. The pilgrims used to turn out and empty every rifle at him. All wasted energy. The animal had a charmed life, the man said, but only brutes in this country could say that. No man here bore a charmed life. He stood in the moonlight with his delicate hooked nose askew, and mica eyes glittering, then strode off with a curt good night. Marlowe could see he was disturbed and puzzled, which made him more hopeful than he'd been for days. It was a great comfort to turn from that chap to his influential friend, the battered, twisted, ruined steamboat. He clambered aboard. She rang under his feet like an empty biscuit tin. Nothing so solid in make, less pretty in shape, but he'd expended enough hard work on her to make him love her. No influential friend would have served him better. She'd given him a chance to find out what he could do. He didn't like work no man did, but he liked what was in the work, the chance to find yourself. Your own reality for yourself, not for others, what no other man can ever know. He wasn't surprised to see someone sitting aft, legs dangling over the mud. He chummed with the few mechanics there, whom the other pilgrims despised. This was the foreman, a boiler-maker, a good worker, lank, bony, yellow-faced, with big, intense eyes. His head was as bald as Marlowe's palm, but his hair seemed to have stuck to his chin and prospered. His beard hung to his waist, a widower with 6 young children left with a sister. His passion was pigeon flying. After work he'd come for talks about his children and pigeons at work, crawling in the mud under the steamboat. He'd tie up his beard in a white serviette with loops over his ears. Evenings he could be seen squatting on the bank, rinsing that wrapper carefully in the creek, then spreading it on a bush to dry. Marlowe slapped him on the back and shouted they would have rivets. The man scrambled up, exclaiming, "No! Rivets!" as if he couldn't believe his ears, then in a low voice, "They behaved like lunatics." Marlowe put his finger to his nose and nodded mysteriously. The man cried good for him, snapped his fingers, lifted a foot. Marlowe tried a jig. They capered on the iron deck. A frightful clatter came out of that empty hulk, and the virgin forest on the other bank sent it back in a thundering roll upon the sleeping station. A dark figure obscured the manager's lighted doorway, vanished. Then the doorway itself vanished. They stopped. The silence driven away by their stamping flowed back from the land, the great wall of vegetation exuberant, entangled, motionless in the moonlight, was like a rioting invasion of soundless life, a rolling wave of plants ready to topple over the creek and sweep every little man out of his existence. And it moved not. A deadened burst of splashes and snorts reached them from afar, as if an ichthyosaurus were bathing in the great river. The boilermaker asked reasonably why they shouldn't get the rivets. Marlowe didn't know any reason why not. They'd come in 3 weeks, he said confidently. But they didn't. Instead of rivets came an invasion, an infliction, a visitation. It came in sections over 3 weeks, each headed by a donkey carrying a white man in new clothes and tan shoes, bowing to the impressed pilgrims. A quarrelsome band of footsore natives trod on the donkey's heels. Tents, camp stools, tin boxes, bales were shot down in the courtyard. The air of mystery deepened over the muddle. 5 such installments came with their absurd air of disorderly flight, lugging the loot of outfit shops and provision stores into the wilderness for equitable division. An inextricable mess of things decent in themselves that had human folly made look like spoils of thieving. This devoted band called itself the El Dorado Exploring Expedition. They were sworn to secrecy, but their talk was that of sordid buccaneers, reckless without hardihood, greedy without audacity, cruel without courage. Not an atom of foresight or serious intention in the whole batch. To tear treasure out of the land's bowels was their desire, with no more moral purpose than burglars breaking into a safe. Who paid the expenses Marlowe didn't know, but the manager's uncle was their leader. He resembled a butcher in a poor neighborhood, with sleepy cunning in his eyes, carrying his fat paunch ostentatiously on short legs. He spoke to no one but his nephew. The two roamed all day with heads close together in an everlasting confab. Marlowe had given up worrying about rivets. One's capacity for that kind of folly was more limited than you'd suppose. He let things slide. He had plenty of time for meditation, and now and then gave some thought to Kurtz. Not very interested. Still, curious to see whether this man who had come out equipped with moral ideas of some sort would climb to the top after all, and how he would set about his work when there. One evening, lying flat on the steamer's deck, he heard voices approaching, the nephew and uncle strolling along the bank. He laid his head on his arm again, and nearly dozed off when someone said, as if in his ear, that he was as harmless as a little child but didn't like to be dictated to. Was he the manager or not? He'd been ordered to send Kurtz there. It was incredible. The two were standing on the shore alongside the forepart of the steamboat, just below Marlowe's head. He didn't move. He was sleepy. The uncle grunted that it was unpleasant. The manager said Kurtz had asked the administration to send him there to show what he could do, and he was instructed accordingly. Look at the influence that man must have. Was it not frightful? They agreed it was frightful. Then made bizarre remarks, bits of absurd sentences that got the better of Marlowe's drowsiness. He had pretty nearly all his wits about him when the uncle said the climate might do away with this difficulty for him. Was Kurtz alone there? Yes, the manager answered. Kurtz had sent his assistant down with a note: clear this poor devil out of the country. Don't bother sending more of that sort. He'd rather be alone than have the kind of men the manager could dispose of with him. That was more than a year ago. Could the manager imagine such impudence? The uncle asked hoarsely if anything since then. Ivory. The nephew jerked out lots of it. Prime sort, lots most annoying from him. And with that? The uncle rumbled. Invoice was the fired-out reply. Then silence. They'd been talking about Kurtz. Marlowe was broad awake now, but remained still, having no inducement to move. The elder man growled, vexed, asking how that ivory had come all this way. The other explained with a fleet of canoes in charge of an English half-caste clerk Kurtz had with him. Kurtz had apparently intended to return himself the station bearer of goods, but after coming 300 miles, he'd suddenly decided to go back, starting alone in a small dugout with 4 paddlers, leaving the half-caste to continue down with the ivory. The two seemed astounded at anyone attempting such a thing, at a loss for an adequate motive. But Marlowe felt he saw Kurtz for the first time a distinct glimpse of a dugout, 4 paddling savages, the lone white man turning his back suddenly on headquarters, on relief, on thoughts of home, setting his face toward the depths of the wilderness, toward his empty and desolate station. He didn't know the motive. Perhaps Kurtz was just a fine fellow who stuck to his work for its own sake. His name hadn't been pronounced once. He was that man. The half-caste who had conducted a difficult trip with great prudence and pluck was invariably called that scoundrel. The scoundrel had reported that the man had been very ill and had recovered imperfectly. The two moved away a few paces, strolled back and forth. Marlowe heard military post Dr. 200 miles quite alone now, unavoidable delays, 9 months no news, strange rumors. They approached again, as the manager was saying that no one, as far as he knew, unless a species of wandering trader, a pestilential fellow, snapping ivory from the natives. Who were they talking about now? Marlowe gathered in snatches that this was some man supposed to be in Kurtz's district, of whom the manager did not approve. The manager said they would not be free from unfair competition till one of these fellows was hanged for an example. The uncle grunted. Certainly get him hanged. Why not? Anything could be done in this country. Nobody here, the uncle said, could endanger the manager's position. Why? He stood the climate, he outlasted them all. The danger was in Europe, but before he left, he'd taken care of that. They moved off and whispered. Then their voices rose again. The manager said the extraordinary series of delays was not his fault. He'd done his possible. The fat man sighed. Very sad. The manager's relative ranted on about the other man's foolish, pest-ridden talk, how he'd gone on about each station being a beacon of progress, a center for trade, and for improving the local people. The older man choked on his own indignation. From above, the hidden listener lifted his head just enough to realize they were directly beneath him, close enough that he could have spat onto their hats. The manager tapped his own leg with a twig, while the other man lifted his head and asked how his companion had been feeling since coming out this time. The manager started, then admitted he himself felt wonderful, but the rest of the expedition was sick. They died so fast, he couldn't even ship them out of the country. The uncle grunted in knowing agreement, then thrust out a short arm in a gesture that seemed to beckon toward the forest, the creek, the mud, the river, a dishonoring flourish that appealed to the lurking death and hidden evil in the landscape's heart. The hidden watcher found it so startling. He leapt to his feet, half expecting an answer to that black display of confidence, but the high stillness only confronted the two figures with ominous patience. They both swore aloud out of fright. He suspected, then pretended he didn't exist, and turned back to the station. The sun hung low, and as they leaned forward side by side, their two ridiculous shadows of unequal length trailed behind them over the tall grass without bending a single blade. A few days later, the El Dorado expedition vanished into the patient wilderness, like the sea closing over a diver. Long afterward, news came that all the donkeys had died. He knew nothing of the fate of the less valuable animals. He didn't inquire. He was too excited at the prospect of meeting Kurt soon, which meant, comparatively speaking, in about 2 months from the day they left the creek, when they finally reached the bank below Kurtz's station. Going up that river felt like traveling back to the world's earliest beginnings, when vegetation rioted and big trees were kings. An empty stream, a great silence, an impenetrable forest. The air was warm, thick, heavy, sluggish. The sunshine brought no joy. Long stretches of waterway ran on, deserted, into gloom. On silvery sandbanks, hippos and alligators sunned themselves side by side. The broadening waters flowed through mobs of wooded islands. You lost your way as in a desert. butting all day against shoals, trying to find the channel, until you felt bewitched and cut off from everything you'd once known. Past moments came back as restless, noisy dreams remembered with wonder among the overwhelming realities of plants, water, and silence. This stillness did not resemble peace. It was the stillness of an implacable force brooding over an inscrutable intention, looking at you with vengeful aspect. He later got used to it, stopped seeing it, had no time. He had to guess at the channel, discern hidden banks mostly by inspiration, watch for sunken stones, learn to clap his teeth shut before his heart flew out when he narrowly missed some infernal snag. He kept lookout for dead wood to cut up at night for the next day's steaming. When you attend to surface incidents, the real truth fades. The inner truth stays hidden, luckily. But he still felt its mysterious stillness watching him at his monkey tricks. Someone in the listening audience growled at him to be civil. He apologized, forgot the heartache that made up the rest of the price. What did the price matter if the trick was well done? He hadn't done badly either, since he managed not to sink the steamboat on his first trip. He sweated and shivered over that business considerably. For a seaman, scraping the bottom of what's supposed to float is the unpardonable sin. No one may know, but you never forget the thump of blow to the very heart. You remember it, dream of it, wake up at night years after, and go hot and cold. He didn't pretend the steamboat floated all the time. More than once, she had to wade with 20 cannibals splashing and pushing. They'd enlisted some of those chaps along the way for a crew, fine fellows in their place, men he could work with, grateful to them. They didn't eat each other before his face. They'd brought hippo meat that went rotten and made the wilderness stink in his nostrils. He had the manager on board and 3 or 4 pilgrims with their staves. Sometimes they came upon a station close to the bank, clinging to the unknown, and white men rushing out of tumble-down hovels with gestures of joy and surprise seemed strangely captive under a spell. The word ivory would ring in the air for a while, then they moved on into silence, between high walls of the winding way, reverberating the ponderous beat of the stern wheel. Trees, millions of trees, massive, immense at their foot, hugging the bank, crept the little begrimed steamboat like a sluggish beetle on the floor of a lofty portico. It made you feel very small and lost, yet not altogether depressed. If you were small, the grimy beetle crawled on, which was exactly what you wanted. For him, it crawled toward Kurtz exclusively. Those steam pipe leaks made it very slow. The reaches opened before them and closed behind, as if the forest stepped across the water to bar their return. They penetrated deeper into the heart of darkness. Very quiet there. At night, drums behind the curtain of trees would roll up the river and remain faintly sustained till daybreak, whether meaning war, peace, or prayer. They couldn't tell. Dawns came with a chill stillness. Woodcutters slept. Fires burned low, a snapping twig made you start. They were wanderers on a prehistoric Earth that looked like an unknown planet. They could have fancied themselves the first men taking possession of an accursed inheritance. Then, struggling around a bend, they glimpsed rush walls, peaked grass roofs, bursts of yells, whirls of black limbs, clapping hands, stamping feet, swaying bodies, rolling eyes under heavy motionless foliage. The steamer toiled along the edge of a black, incomprehensible frenzy. Prehistoric men were cursing, praying, welcoming who could tell. They glided past like phantoms, wondering and appalled, as sane men before an outbreak in a madhouse. They couldn't understand because they were too far, couldn't remember because they traveled in the night of first ages, leaving hardly a sign and no memories. The earth seemed unearthly. Back home, you look at a conquered monster's shackled form, but there, you looked at something monstrous and free. And the men, they weren't inhuman. That was the worst of it. The suspicion they were not inhuman. It came slowly. They howled, leaped, spun, made horrid faces. But what thrilled you was the thought of their humanity like yours. Your remote kinship with that wild uproar. Ugly, yes, but if you were man enough, you'd admit there was in you the faintest trace of response to that terrible frankness, a dim suspicion of meaning you could comprehend. Why not? The human mind is capable of anything. Everything is in it, all past and all future. Joy, fear, sorrow, devotion, valor, rage, who can tell? But truth, stripped of time's cloak. Let fools gape, a man knows and can look without blinking. But he must be as much a man as those on the shore. He must meet that truth with his own true stuff, his inborn strength. Principles won't do. Acquisitions, clothes, pretty rags, they fly off at the first good shake. You need deliberate belief. Amid that fiendish noise, he had a voice too for good or evil. His speech couldn't be silenced. A fool with fine sentiments is always safe. Someone grunted. Did they wonder he didn't go ashore for a howl and dance? He had no time. He had to mess about with white lead and blanket strips, putting bandages on leaky steam pipes, watch the steering, circumvent snags, get the tin pot along by hook or crook. There was enough surface truth in those things to save a wiser man. Between whiles, he looked after the savage fireman, an improved specimen who could fire a vertical boiler. Watching him was like seeing a dog in a parody of breeches and a feather hat walking on its hind legs. A few months of training had done for that really fine chap. He squinted at the steam and water gauges with evident intrepidity, filed teeth, wool of his pate shaved into queer patterns, 3 ornamental scars on each cheek. He ought to have been clapping and stamping on the bank, but instead, he was a thrall to strange witchcraft, full of improving knowledge. He'd been instructed that if the water in that transparent thing disappeared, the evil spirit inside the boiler would get angry from thirst and take terrible vengeance. So he sweated and fired up and watched the glass fearfully, with an improvised rag charm on his arm and a polished bone as big as a watch stuck flatways through his lower lip. The wooded bank slipped past slowly, shore noise left behind, interminable miles of silence, and they crept on toward Kurtz. But snags were thick, water treacherous and shallow. The boiler had a sulky devil in it, and neither he nor the fireman had any time to peer into their creepy thoughts. About 50 miles below the inner station, they came upon a reed hut, an inclined melancholy pole with tattered remnants of some flag still flying, and a neatly stacked woodpile. Unexpected. They came to the bank, and found on the woodpile a flat board with faded pencil writing on it. Deciphered. It said, "Wood for you. Hurry up. Approach cautiously." A signature, illegible, not Kurtz. A much longer word. Hurry up. Where? Up the river. Approach cautiously, but they hadn't, yet the warning couldn't have been meant for a place where it could only be found after approach. Something was wrong above. But what? And how much? That was the question. They commented on the imbecility of that telegraphic style. The bush around said nothing and wouldn't let them look far. A torn red twill curtain hung in the hut's doorway, flapping sadly in their faces. The dwelling was dismantled, but they could see a white man had lived there not very long ago. Inside the dismantled hut, a rough plank table stood on 2 posts. In a dark corner lay a heap of rubbish. By the door, he picked up a book. Its covers were gone, the pages thumbed into dirty softness, but the spine had been lovingly restitched with clean white cotton thread. An extraordinary find. The title announced an inquiry into seamanship by a man named Towser, or Towson, a master in His Majesty's Navy. Dreary reading with diagrams and repulsive tables, the copy 60 years old. He handled the fragile antiquity with great tenderness, afraid it might dissolve in his fingers. The author earnestly investigated the breaking strain of chains and tackle, not enthralling. But at first glance you could see a singleness of intention, an honest concern for the right way to work humble pages, luminous with more than professional light. The simple old sailor's talk of chains and purchases made him forget the jungle and the pilgrims in a delicious sensation of finding something unmistakably real. The book's presence was wonderful enough, but the penciled margin notes were even more astounding. He couldn't believe his eyes. They were in cipher. Fancy a man lugging such a book into this nowhere, studying it, and making notes in cipher. An extravagant mystery. He'd been dimly aware of a worrying noise for some time. Lifting his eyes, he saw the woodpile gone, and the manager with all the pilgrims shouting from the riverbank. He slipped the book into his pocket. Leaving off reading felt like tearing himself away from an old, solid friendship. He started the lame engine ahead. The manager exclaimed, "It must be that miserable traitor, that intruder," casting a malevolent look back at the place they'd left. He observed, "The man must be English." The manager muttered darkly that wouldn't save him from trouble if he wasn't careful. He replied with assumed innocence that no man was safe from trouble anywhere. The current ran more rapidly now. The steamer seemed at her last gasp, the stern wheel flopping languidly. He caught himself listening on tiptoe for the next beat, expecting the wretched thing to give up any moment, like watching the last flickers of a life. Still they crawled. Sometimes he'd pick out a tree ahead to measure progress toward Kurtz, but he always lost it before they drew abreast. Keeping his eyes so long on one thing tested human patience. The manager displayed beautiful resignation. He himself fretted, fumed, argued with himself about whether to speak openly with Kurtz, but before reaching any conclusion, it occurred to him that speech, silence, any action of his, would be mere futility. What did it matter? Who knew or ignored anything, or who was manager? A flash of insight. The affair's essentials lay deep under the surface, beyond his reach and power of meddling. Toward evening of the second day, they judged themselves about 8 miles from Kurtz's station. He wanted to push on, but the manager looked grave, warning that the navigation was so dangerous. With the sun already low, they should wait until morning. Moreover, if they were to follow the warning to approach cautiously, they must do so in daylight, not dusk or dark. Sensible enough. 8 miles meant nearly 3 hours steaming. He could also see suspicious ripples at the upper end of the reach. Still, the delay annoyed him beyond expression, and unreasonably, since one more night couldn't matter after so many months. With plenty of wood and caution the word, he brought up in midstream. The reach was narrow, straight, with high sides like a railway cutting. Dusk came gliding in long before sunset. The current ran smooth and swift, but a dumb immobility sat on the banks. Living trees lashed by creepers, every bush of undergrowth, might have been turned to stone down to the slenderest twig, the lightest leaf. Not sleep unnatural, like a trance, not the faintest sound. You looked on amazed, suspecting yourself deaf. Then night came suddenly and struck you blind as well. Around 3 in the morning some large fish leaped. The loud splash made him jump as if a gun had fired. At sunrise a white fog appeared, warm, clammy, more blinding than night. It didn't shift or drive, it just stood there, solid all around. At 8 or 9 perhaps, it lifted like a shutter. They glimpsed the towering multitude of trees, the immense matted jungle, the blazing little sun hanging over it all perfectly still. Then the white shutter came down again, smoothly sliding, as if in greased grooves. He ordered the chain they'd begun heaving in to be paid out again. Before it stopped running with a muffled rattle, a cry, a very loud cry of infinite desolation, soared slowly in the opaque air. It ceased. A complaining clamor, modulated in savage discords, filled their ears. The sheer unexpectedness made his hair stir under his cap. It seemed as though the mist itself had screamed, suddenly from all sides at once, this tumultuous, mournful uproar. It culminated in a hurried outbreak of almost intolerable shrieking, which stopped short, leaving them stiffened in silly attitudes, obstinately listening to an equally appalling and excessive silence. One of the pilgrims, a little fat man with sandy hair, red whiskers, side-spring boots, and pink pajamas tucked into his socks, stammered out a question about what it meant. 2 others stood open-mouthed, then dashed into the cabin and rushed out with Winchesters at the ready, darting scared glances. What they could see was just the steamer itself, its outlines blurred as if about to dissolve, and a misty strip of water perhaps 2 feet broad around her. That was all. The rest of the world was nowhere gone, disappeared without a whisper or shadow. He went forward, and ordered the chain hauled in short, ready to trip the anchor and move at once if necessary. An odd voice whispered whether they would attack. Another murmured, they'd all be butchered in this fog. Faces twitched, hands trembled slightly, eyes forgot to wink. He watched the contrast between the white men and the black crew members, who were as much strangers to this part of the river as the whites, though their homes lay only 800 miles away. The whites were greatly discomposed, with a curious look of being painfully shocked by such an outrageous row. The others had an alert, naturally interested expression, but their faces remained essentially quiet, even those one or two who grinned as they hauled the chain. Several exchanged short, grunting phrases that seemed to settle the matter to their satisfaction. Their headman, a young, broad-chested black severely draped in dark blue fringed cloths, with fierce nostrils and hair done up in oily ringlets, stood near him. He nodded for good fellowship's sake. The headman snapped that they should catch whoever made the noise and give him to them. He asked what they would do with such a person. The headman curtly answered, they'd eat him, then leaned his elbow on the rail, looking into the fog in a dignified, pensive attitude. He would have been properly horrified had it not occurred to him that the man and his fellows must be very hungry, growing increasingly hungry for at least this past month. They'd been engaged for 6 months, though he didn't think any of them had a clear idea of time, still belonging to the beginnings of time with no inherited experience. As long as there was a piece of paper written over according to some farcical law downriver, nobody troubled about how they would live. They'd brought some rotten hippo meat, which couldn't have lasted long, especially after the pilgrims, amid a shocking hullabaloo, threw a considerable quantity overboard. It looked high-handed, but was legitimate self-defense. You can't breathe dead. Hippo waking, sleeping, and eating while keeping your grip on existence. Besides, they received 3 pieces of brass wire each week, the theory being they could buy provisions in riverside villages. But there were either no villages, or the people were hostile, or the director, who fed out of tins like the rest, didn't want to stop for some recondite reason. Unless they swallowed the wire itself or made loops to snare fish, he didn't see what good their extravagant salary did them. He was paid with regularity worthy of a large trading company. The only edible thing he saw in their possession, though it didn't look eatable at all, was a few lumps of half-cooked cold dough of a dirty lavender color, wrapped in leaves. They swallowed tiny pieces now and then, seemingly more for show than sustenance. Why they didn't attack 30 to 5 and have a good tuck and amazed him now? They were big, powerful men, their skins no longer glossy, and muscles no longer hard, yet something restraining. One of those human secrets that baffle probability had come into play. He looked at them with quickened interest, hoping his own aspect wasn't so unappetizing, a touch of fantastic vanity fitting the dream sensation that pervaded his days. Perhaps he had a little fever, too. He'd often had a little fever or other trifles, playful paw strokes of the wilderness before more serious onslaught. He looked at them with curiosity about their impulses, motives, capacities, weaknesses when brought to the test of inexorable physical necessity. Restraint? What possible restraint? Superstition, disgust, patience, fear, primitive honor. No fear can stand up to hunger. No patience, wear it out. Disgust doesn't exist where hunger is, and superstition, beliefs, principles are less than chaff in a breeze. He knew the devilry of lingering starvation, its torment, black thoughts, brooding ferocity. It takes all a man's inborn strength to fight hunger properly. Easier to face bereavement, dishonor, the perdition of one's soul than prolonged hunger. Sad but true. And these chaps had no earthly reason for scruple. He'd sooner expect restraint from a hyena prowling among corpses. Yet there was the fact facing him, dazzling, like foam on the depths of the sea, a ripple on an unfathomable enigma, a mystery greater than the inexplicable note of desperate grief in that savage clamor that had swept by them behind the blind whiteness of fog. 2 pilgrims quarreled in hurried whispers about which bank, left or right. The manager's voice behind him said it was serious, very serious, and he'd be desolated if anything happened to Kurtz before they came up. He looked at the manager, and had no doubt the man was sincere, the kind who would wish to preserve appearances. That was his restraint. When the manager muttered something about going on at once, he didn't even bother to answer. Both knew it was impossible. If they let go the bottom, they'd be absolutely in space, unable to tell direction, until they fetched against one bank or the other. He made no move. He had no mind for a smash-up in such a deadly place for shipwreck. Drowned or not, they'd perish quickly. After a short silence, the manager authorized him to take all risks. He refused shortly the expected answer, though the tone might have surprised. The manager deferred to his judgment with marked civility. He turned his shoulder in appreciation and looked into the fog. How long would it last? The most hopeless lookout, approaching this Kurtz grubbing for ivory in the wretched bush, was beset by as many dangers as if he'd been an enchanted princess sleeping in a fabulous castle. The manager asked in a confidential tone whether they thought an attack would come. He didn't think they would attack, for several obvious reasons. The thick fog was one. If the natives left the bank in canoes, they'd get lost. Still, he judged the jungle impenetrable, yet eyes were in it, eyes that had seen them. The riverside bushes were very thick, but the undergrowth behind was evidently penetrable. Yet during the short lift he'd seen no canoes in the reach, certainly not abreast of the steamer. What made attack inconceivable was the nature of the cries they'd heard, not fierce, not boding immediate hostile intention. Unexpected, wild, violent as they'd been, they gave an irresistible impression of sorrow. For some reason, the glimpse of the steamboat had filled those savages with unrestrained grief. The danger, if any, came from proximity to a great human passion let loose. Even extreme grief may ultimately vent itself in violence, but more generally takes the form of apathy. The pilgrims stared, too shocked to mock him, probably thinking he'd gone mad with fright. He delivered a lecture, explaining there was no point in worrying. He watched the fog for signs of lifting as a cat watches a mouse for anything else. Their eyes were as useless as if buried in cotton wool. It felt that way too, choking, warm, stifling. What he said, though extravagant, was true. What they later called an attack was really an attempt at repulse, not aggressive, not even defensive in the usual sense, but undertaken under desperation, purely protective. The action began about 2 hours after the fog lifted, roughly a mile and a half below Kurtz's station. They floundered around a bend, and he spotted an islet, a grassy hummock of bright green in midstream. As the reach opened, he saw it was the head of a long sandbank or chain of shallow patches stretching down the river's center, just awash, visible under the water like a man's backbone under his skin. He could go right or left. The banks looked alike, the depth the same, but since the station was on the west side, he headed for the western passage. No sooner had they entered than he realized it was much narrower than he'd thought. To the left lay the long shoal, to the right, a high, steep bank overgrown with bushes, with trees in serried ranks above. Twigs overhung the current thickly, with large limbs projecting rigidly over the stream. Late afternoon now, the forest gloomy, a broad strip of shadow already fallen on the water. They steamed up very slowly. He steered well inshore, the water deepest near the bank, according to the sounding pole. One of his hungry, forbearing friends was sounding in the bows just below him. The steamboat was like a decked scow, 2 little teakwood houses with doors and windows, boiler in the fore end, machinery astern. A light roof on stanchions covered everything. The funnel projected through it, and just in front of the funnel a small cabin of light planks served as a pilot house containing a couch, 2 camp stools, a loaded Martini Henry in a corner, a tiny table, and the steering wheel. A wide door in front, a broad shutter on each side, always thrown open. He spent his days perched on the extreme fore end of that roof. Before the door at night he slept on the couch. The helmsman was an athletic black from some coast tribe, educated by his poor predecessor, who wore brass earrings and a blue cloth wrapper from waist to ankles, and thought very highly of himself, the most unstable fool he'd ever seen. He steered with a swagger when watched, but if left alone, he became prey to abject funk. He was looking down at the sounding pole, annoyed to see a little more of it stick out of the river each time, when his poleman suddenly gave up, stretched flat on the deck without hauling his pole in, though he kept hold, letting it trail. At the same time, the fireman below sat down abruptly before his furnace and ducked his head. Then he had to look at the river quickly because a snag lay in the fairway. Little sticks flew about, thick, whizzing before his nose, dropping below, striking behind him against the pilot house. All the while, the river, shore, and woods remained perfectly quiet. Only the heavy, splashy thump of the stern wheel and the patter of those things. They cleared the snag clumsily. Arrows, They were being shot at. He stepped in quickly to close the landside shutter. The fool helmsman, hands on the spokes, lifted his knees high, stamping, champing his mouth like a reined-in horse. They staggered within 10 feet of the bank. He leaned out to swing the heavy shutter, and saw a face among the leaves at his own level, looking very fierce and steady. Then, as if a veil had been removed, he made out in the tangled gloom naked breasts, arms, legs, glaring eyes, the bush swarming with bronze-colored human limbs in motion. Twigs shook, swayed, rustled, arrows flew out. Then the shutter closed. He told the helmsman to steer straight. The man held his head rigid, face forward, but his eyes rolled, his feet moved gently, his mouth foamed. He yelled at him to keep quiet, as useless as ordering a tree not to sway. He darted out. Below, a great scuffle of feet on the iron deck, confused exclamations, a voice screaming whether they could turn back. He caught sight of a V-shaped ripple ahead. Another snag. A fusillade burst out under his feet. The pilgrims had opened fire with Winchesters, squirting lead into the bush. A great deal of smoke came up and drove slowly forward. He swore at it, unable to see the ripple or the snag. He stood in the doorway. Peering arrows came in swarms. Might have been poisoned, but looked like they wouldn't kill a cat. The bush began to howl. Their woodcutters raised a warlike whoop. A rifle report just at his back deafened him. He glanced over his shoulder. The pilot house was full of noise and smoke as he made a dash for the wheel. The fool helmsman had dropped everything to throw the shutter open and fire the Martini Henry. He stood before the wide opening, glaring. He yelled at him to come back while straightening the sudden twist. There was no room to turn. The snag was somewhere ahead in that confounded smoke, so he crowded the steamboat right into the bank, where he knew the water was deep. They tore slowly along the overhanging bushes in a whirl of broken twigs and flying leaves. The fusillade below stopped short, as he'd foreseen the squirts empty. He threw his head back to a glinting whiz that traversed the pilot house, in one shutter hole and out the other. Looking past the mad helmsman who was shaking the empty rifle and yelling at the shore, he saw vague forms of men running bent double, leaping, gliding, extinct yet incomplete. Something big appeared in the air before the shutter. The rifle went overboard. The man stepped back swiftly, looked at him over his shoulder in an extraordinary, profound, familiar manner, and fell at his feet. The side of his head hit the wheel twice, and the end of what looked like a long cane clattered around, knocking over a camp stool. It seemed after wrenching that thing from someone ashore, he had lost his balance. The thin smoke blew away. They were clear of the snag. Looking ahead, he could see that in another 100 yards he'd be free to sheer off from the bank. But his feet felt so very warm and wet that he had to look down. The man had rolled on his back, staring straight up, both hands clutching that cane. It was the shaft of a spear thrown or lounged through the opening that had caught him in the side just below the ribs. The blade had gone in out of sight after making a frightful gash. His shoes were full. A pool of blood lay very still, gleaming dark red under the wheel. The man's eyes shone with an amazing luster. The fusillade burst out again. He looked at the narrator anxiously, gripping the spear like something precious, afraid it might be taken away. He forced his eyes away to attend the steering. With one hand he felt above his head for the steam whistle line and jerked out screech after screech hurriedly. The tumult of angry yells stopped instantly. Then from the depths of the woods came a tremulous, prolonged wail of mournful fear and utter despair, as if following the flight of the last hope from the earth. A great commotion in the bush. The arrow shower stopped. A few dropping shots rang out. Then silence. The languid beat of the stern wheel came plainly to his ears. He put the helm hard a starboard just as the pilgrim in pink pajamas, very hot and agitated, appeared in the doorway, beginning an official message from the manager, then stopping short at the sight of the wounded man. The two whites stood over him. His lustrous, inquiring glance enveloped them both. It looked as if he might put some question in an understandable language, but he died without a sound, without moving a limb, without twitching a muscle, only in the very last moment, as if responding to some sign they could not see, some whisper they could not hear. He frowned heavily, giving his black death mask an inconceivably somber, brooding, menacing expression. The lustrous inquiry faded swiftly into vacant glassiness. He asked the agent eagerly if he could steer. The agent looked dubious, but he grabbed his arm, making it clear he meant him to steer whether or not. He was morbidly anxious to change his shoes and socks. The fellow murmured that the man was dead, immensely impressed. He agreed, tugging madly at his shoelaces, and added that, by the way, he supposed Kurtz was dead as well by this time. For the moment, that was the dominant thought, a sense of extreme disappointment, as if he'd been striving after something altogether without substance. He couldn't have been more disgusted if he'd traveled all this way solely to talk with Kurtz. He flung one shoe overboard and realized that was exactly what he'd been looking forward to, a talk with Kurtz. He discovered he had never imagined Kurtz doing anything, only discoursing. He didn't think, "Now I will never see him," or "Now I will never shake his hand," but "Now I will never hear him." The man presented himself as a voice, not that he didn't connect him with action. Hadn't he been told in tones of jealousy and admiration that Kurtz had collected, bartered, swindled, or stolen more ivory than all other agents combined? That wasn't the point. The point was his being a gifted creature, and of all his gifts the one that stood out, that carried a sense of real presence, was his ability to talk, the gift of expression, bewildering, illuminating, exalted, and contemptible, a pulsating stream of light, or the deceitful flow from an impenetrable darkness. The other shoe went flying to the devil god of the river. It was all over. Too late. He would never hear that man speak. His sorrow had an extravagant emotion, like the howling sorrow of those savages in the bush. He couldn't have felt more lonely desolation if robbed of a belief or missed his destiny in life. A pause of profound stillness. A match flared, revealing Marlowe's lean, worn, hollow face with downward folds and dropped eyelids, an aspect of concentrated attention. He drew vigorously on his pipe. The tiny flame flickered, making his face retreat and advance out of the night. The match went out. He cried out at the absurdity of it all, the worst of trying to tell. Here they all were, each moored with 2 good addresses, excellent appetites, normal temperature year to year. What could they expect from a man who, out of sheer nervousness, had just flung a pair of new shoes overboard? It was amazing he hadn't shed tears. He was proud of his fortitude. He'd been cut to the quick at losing the inestimable privilege of listening to the gifted Kurtz. But he was wrong. The privilege was waiting. He heard more than enough. And he was right, too, a voice. Kurtz was very little more than a voice. He heard him, this voice, other voices, all of them so little more than voices, and the memory of that time lingered like a dying vibration of one immense jabber, silly, atrocious, sordid, savage, or simply mean without any sense. Voices. Voices, even the girl herself. He was silent for a long time. He finally laid the ghost of Kurtz's gifts with a lie, then caught himself. Had he mentioned a girl? She was completely out of it. Women belonged out of it, in their own beautiful world, and needed help staying there. Hearing Kurtz's disinterred body say, "My intended," would have shown anyone how utterly outside that world she was, and Kurtz's lofty frontal bone, impressively bald, like an ivory ball. The wilderness had patted his head, caressed him, and he had withered. It had taken him, loved him, embraced him, gotten into his veins, consumed his flesh, sealed his soul through inconceivable devilish initiation. He was its spoiled, pampered favorite, ivory, heaps and stacks of it. The old mud shanty was bursting. You'd think no tusk remained in the whole country. The manager had called it mostly fossil, disparagingly, but it was no more fossil than the narrator himself. They called it fossil when dug up. Apparently the natives sometimes buried tusks, but they couldn't bury this parcel deep enough to save Kurtz from his fate. They filled the steamboat with ivory, piling a lot on the deck, so Kurtz could see and enjoy it as long as he could see the appreciation of that favor remain to the last. Hearing him say, "My ivory, yes," he heard it. My intended, my ivory, my station, my river, my everything belonged to him. It made the listener hold his breath, expecting the wilderness to burst into a prodigious peal of laughter that would shake the fixed stars. Everything belonged to him, but that was a trifle. The thing was to know what he belonged to, how many powers of darkness claimed him. That reflection made you creepy all over, impossible, and not good for one to try imagining. He had taken a high seat amongst the devils of the land, literally. No listener could understand, with solid pavement underfoot, kind neighbors ready to cheer or to attack, stepping delicately between butcher and policeman in holy terror of scandal, gallows, and lunatic asylums. How could they imagine what region of the first ages a man's untrammeled feet might take him through utter solitude and silence, where no warning voice of a kind neighbor whispered of public opinion? These little things made the great difference. When they were gone, you fell back on innate strength, on capacity for faithfulness. No fool ever made a bargain for his soul with the devil. The fool was too much a fool, or the devil too much a devil. Or you might be such an exalted creature as to be deaf and blind to anything but heavenly sights and sounds, then earth was only a standing place. Whether that was loss or gain, he wouldn't say. But most of them were neither. Earth was a place to live, where you put up with sights, sounds, smells, breathe dead hippo, so to speak, and not be contaminated. That was where your strength came in faith and your ability to dig unostentatious holes, to bury the stuff in devotion, not to yourself, but to an obscure back-breaking business. Difficult enough. He wasn't trying to excuse or explain. He was trying to account for Kurtz, for his shade. This initiated wraith from the back of nowhere had honored him with its amazing confidence before vanishing, because it could speak English to him. The original Kurtz had been educated partly in England, his sympathies in the right place, as he'd said himself. His mother was half English, his father half French. All Europe contributed to making Kurtz, and the International Society for the Suppression of Savage Customs had entrusted him with writing a report for future guidance. He'd written it too, 17 pages of close writing he'd found time for, eloquent and vibrating, though too high-strung. That must have been before his nerves went wrong, before he presided at midnight dances ending with unspeakable rites offered up to him to Kurtz himself. But the report was a beautiful piece of writing. The opening paragraph, in light of later information, struck him as ominous. The argument that whites from their development level must appear as supernatural beings to savages, approaching with the might of a deity, and that by simple exercise of will, they could exert practically unbounded power for good. From that point, it soared. The peroration was magnificent, giving the notion of an exotic immensity ruled by august benevolence, making him tingle with enthusiasm, the unbounded power of eloquence, of burning noble words. No practical hints interrupted the magic current of phrases, except a note at the foot of the last page, scrawled much later in an unsteady hand, which might be an exposition of a method. Very simple. At the end of that moving appeal to every altruistic sentiment, it blazed luminous and terrifying like lightning in a serene sky. Exterminate all the brutes. The curious part was that Kurtz had apparently forgotten all about that valuable postscriptum, because later, when he came to himself, he repeatedly entreated the narrator to take good care of my pamphlet. Sure, it would have a good influence on his career. He had full information about all these things, and as it turned out, he was to have the care of Kurtz's memory. He'd done enough for it to give him the indisputable right to lay it for an everlasting rest in the dustbin of progress among all the sweepings and, figuratively speaking, all the dead cats of civilization. But he couldn't choose. Kurtz wouldn't be forgotten. Whatever he was not common. He had the power to charm or frighten rudimentary souls into an aggravated witch dance in his honor. He could fill the pilgrim's small souls with bitter misgivings. He had at least one devoted friend, and he had conquered one soul that was neither rudimentary nor tainted with self-seeking. No, he couldn't forget Kurtz, though he wasn't prepared to affirm the fellow was exactly worth the life they'd lost getting to him. He missed his late helmsman. Awfully missed him even while the body still lay in the pilot-house. Strange to regret a savage who was no more account than a grain of sand in a black Sahara. But don't you see, the man had done something, had steered. For months he'd had that man at his back, a help, an instrument, a kind of partnership. The helmsman steered for him. He had to look after him, worried about his deficiencies, and a subtle bond had been created, which he only became aware of when it suddenly broke. The intimate profundity of that look when the man received his hurt remained in his memory like a claim of distant kinship affirmed in a supreme moment. Poor fool. If only he'd left that shutter alone. He had no restraint. No restraint, just like Kurtz, a tree swayed by wind. As soon as he'd put on dry slippers, he dragged the body out, first jerking the spear from his side, an operation he performed with eyes shut tight. The man's heels leaped together over the little doorstep. His shoulders pressed to the narrator's breast. He hugged him from behind desperately. Heavy, heavy, heavier than any man on earth. Then without more ado, he tipped him overboard. The current snatched him like a wisp of grass. The body rolled over twice before he lost sight of it forever. All the pilgrims and the manager congregated on the awning deck around the pilot house, chattering like excited magpies, with a scandalized murmur at his heartless promptitude. What they wanted to keep that body hanging about for he couldn't guess, embalm it maybe. But he'd heard another, very ominous murmur on the deck below. His woodcutter friends were likewise scandalized, with a better show of reason, though the reason itself was quite inadmissible. He'd made up his mind that if his late helmsman was to be eaten, the fishes alone should have him. He'd been a very second-rate helmsman alive, but dead. He might become a first-class temptation and cause startling trouble. Besides, he was anxious to take the wheel. The man in pink pajamas was a hopeless duffer. He took the wheel directly the simple funeral was over. They went half-speed, keeping right in midstream, and he listened to the talk around him. They'd given up Kurtz, given up the station. Kurtz was dead. The station burnt. The red-haired pilgrim was beside himself, thinking that at least poor Kurtz had been properly revenged, dancing and asking whether they'd made a glorious slaughter, this bloodthirsty little gingery beggar who had nearly fainted when he saw the wounded man. He couldn't help saying they'd made a glorious lot of smoke anyway. He'd seen from the rustling and flying bush tops that almost all the shots had gone too high. You couldn't hit anything unless you aimed and fired from the shoulder. These chaps fired from the hip with eyes shut. The retreat, he maintained, and he was right, was caused by the screeching of the steam whistle. Upon this they forgot Kurtz and began howling at him with indignant protests. The manager stood by the wheel, murmuring confidentially about the necessity of getting well downriver before dark, when he saw in the distance a clearing on the riverside and the outlines of some building. He asked what it was. The manager clapped his hands in wonder. It was the station. He edged in at once, still at half speed. Through his glasses, he saw a hill slope with rare trees, perfectly free of undergrowth. A long decaying building on the summit was half buried in high grass. Large holes in the peaked roof gaped black from afar, with jungle and woods as background. No enclosure or fence, though there had been one. Apparently half a dozen slim posts remained in a row, roughly trimmed, with upper ends ornamented by round carved balls. The rails between had disappeared. The forest surrounded everything. The riverbank was clear, and on the waterside he saw a white man under a cartwheel hat, beckoning persistently with his whole arm. Examining the forest edge above and below, he was almost certain he could see movements, human forms gliding here and there. He steamed past prudently, stopped the engines, and let her drift down. The man on shore began shouting, urging them to land. The manager screamed that they'd been attacked. The other yelled back cheerfully that he knew. It was all right. Come along, he was glad. The man's aspect reminded him of something funny he'd seen somewhere. As he maneuvered to get alongside, he asked himself what this fellow looked like, then got it. A harlequin. His clothes were made of brown holland, probably, but covered all over with bright patches, blue, red, yellow on back, front, elbows, knees, colored binding round his jacket, scarlet edging at trouser bottoms. The sunshine made him look extremely gay and wonderfully neat, because you could see how beautifully the patching had been done. A beardless, boyish face, very fair, no features to speak of, nose peeling, little blue eyes, smiles and frowns, chasing each other like sunshine and shadow on a windswept plain. He cried out a warning about a snag lodged there last night. Another snag, he swore shamefully, having nearly holed his cripple to finish off the charming trip. The harlequin turned his little pug nose up and asked if he was English. He shouted back from the wheel asking the same. The smiles vanished. The man shook his head, sorry for his disappointment, then brightened, telling him, never mind. He asked if they were in time. The man replied that Kurtz was up there, tossing his head up the hill and becoming gloomy. All of a sudden his face like autumn sky, overcast one moment and bright the next. When the manager and the armed pilgrims had gone to the house, this chap came on board. He said he didn't like it these natives were in the bush. The man earnestly assured him it was all right. They were simple people, he was glad they'd come. It had taken all his time to keep the natives off. But he just said it was all right. The man corrected himself. Oh, they meant no harm. Not exactly. Then vivaciously he remarked that the pilot house wanted a clean-up. In the next breath, he advised keeping enough steam on the boiler to blow the whistle in case of trouble. One good screech would do more than all their rifles. Simple people, he repeated. He rattled away at such a rate he overwhelmed the listener, trying to make up for lots of silence, and even hinted laughing that such was the case. He asked whether the man talked with Kurtz. The harlequin exclaimed with severe exultation that you didn't talk with that man, you listened to him. But now he waved his arm and plunged into utter depths of despondency. Then in a moment came up again with a jump, possessed both the narrator's hands, shook them continuously while gabbling about brother sailor, honor, pleasure, delight, introducing himself, Russian, son of an archpriest, government of Tambov, then noticing the tobacco, English tobacco, excellent, brotherly. Where was a sailor who didn't smoke? The pipe soothed the harlequin. The narrator gradually pieced together his story. He'd run away from school, gone to sea on a Russian ship, run away again, served on English ships, and was now reconciled with his father, the archpriest. He made a point of that. But when young, one must see things, gather experience and ideas, enlarge the mind. The narrator interrupted here. The young man replied, youthfully solemn and reproachful, that you could never tell here he had met Kurtz. The narrator held his tongue after that. It appeared the Russian had persuaded a Dutch trading house on the coast to fit him out with stores and goods, then started for the interior with a light heart and no more idea of what would happen than a baby. He'd been wandering alone on that river for nearly 2 years, cut off from everything. He was 25, not as young as he looked. Old Van Sheeten had told him to go to the devil, but he stuck to the man, talked and talked, until Van Sheeten got afraid he'd talk the hind leg off his favorite dog, so he gave him some cheap things and a few guns, hoping never to see his face again. Good old Dutchman. The Russian had sent him one small lot of ivory a year ago, so he couldn't be called a little thief when he got back. He didn't care about the rest. He'd stack some wood for them. That was his old house, did they see? The narrator gave him Towson's book. The young man made as if to kiss him but restrained himself. Ecstatic it was, the only book he'd had left, and he'd thought he'd lost it. So many accidents happened going about alone. Canoes got upset. Sometimes you had to clear out quickly when people got angry. He thumbed the pages. The narrator asked if he'd made notes in Russian. He nodded. The narrator said he'd thought they were written in cipher. The young man laughed, then turned serious. He'd had lots of trouble keeping the people off. Asked if they wanted to kill him, he cried out, "Oh no!" then checked himself. The narrator pursued why they'd attacked. The Russian hesitated, then said shamefacedly that they didn't want Kurtz to go. The narrator nodded curiously. The young man nodded back, full of mystery and wisdom, then cried that this man had enlarged his mind, opening his arms wide with his perfectly round little blue eyes staring. The narrator looked at him, lost in astonishment. There he stood in motley, as if escaped from a troupe of mimes, enthusiastic, fabulous, his very existence improbable, inexplicable, bewildering, an insoluble problem, inconceivable how he'd existed, succeeded in getting so far, managed to remain. The young man said he'd gone a little further, then still further, till he'd gone so far he didn't know how he'd ever get back. But never mind, plenty of time. He'd manage. He urged the narrator to take Kurtz away quick. The glamour of youth enveloped his party-colored rags, his destitution, his loneliness, the essential desolation of his futile wanderings. For months, for years, his life hadn't been worth a day's purchase yet. There he was, gallantly, thoughtlessly alive, indestructible solely by virtue of his few years, and unreflecting audacity. The narrator felt something like admiration, even envy. Glamour urged him on. Glamour kept him unscathed. He wanted nothing from the wilderness but space to breathe and push on through, to exist and move onward at the greatest possible risk, with maximum privation. If the absolutely pure, uncalculating, impractical spirit of adventure had ever ruled a human being, it ruled this bee-patched youth. The narrator almost envied him that modest, clear flame, which seemed to have consumed all thought of self so completely that even while talking to you, you forgot it was he who'd gone through these things. But he didn't envy his devotion to Kurtz. The young man hadn't meditated over it. It came to him, and he accepted it with eager fatalism. To the narrator, it seemed about the most dangerous thing he'd encountered so far. They had come together unavoidably, like two ships becalmed near each other, finally lying and rubbing sides. Kurtz wanted an audience. On one occasion, encamped in the forest, they'd talked all night, or rather, Kurtz had talked. The Russian, transported at the recollection, said they'd talked of everything. He forgot such a thing as sleep. The night didn't seem to last an hour. Everything, including love. The narrator was amused. The young man insisted it wasn't what he thought it was in general. Kurtz had made him see things. He threw his arms up. The woodcutter's headman, lounging nearby, turned his heavy glittering eyes on him. The narrator looked around, and for reasons he couldn't name, the land, the river, the jungle, the very arch of the blazing sky never appeared so hopeless and dark, so impenetrable to human thought, so pitiless to human weakness. He asked whether the Russian had been with Kurtz ever since. On the contrary, their intercourse had been much broken by various causes. The Russian had managed to nurse Kurtz through 2 illnesses. He alluded to it as a risky feat, but as a rule Kurtz wandered alone far in the forest depths. He often came to the station and waited days and days for Kurtz to turn up. It was worth waiting for, sometimes. Asked what Kurtz was doing exploring. The Russian said yes. He'd discovered lots of villages, a lake too, though he didn't know exactly in what direction. It was dangerous to inquire too much. But mostly his expeditions had been for ivory. The narrator objected that by that time, Kurtz had no goods to trade with. The Russian answered, looking away, that there was still a good lot of cartridges left. The narrator said plainly that Kurtz had raided the country. The Russian nodded. Not alone, surely? He muttered something about the villages around the lake. The narrator suggested Kurtz had gotten the tribe to follow him. The Russian fidgeted and said they adored him. The tone was so extraordinary. The narrator looked at him, searchingly curious to see his mingled eagerness and reluctance to speak. The man filled Kurtz's life, occupied his thoughts, swayed his emotions. The Russian burst out that Kurtz had come to the natives with thunder and lightning. They'd never seen anything like it, and it was very terrible. You couldn't judge Kurtz as an ordinary man. Just to give an idea, Kurtz had even wanted to shoot him one day, but he didn't judge him. The narrator cried out in surprise, "What for?" The Russian explained that he'd had a small lot of ivory from a village chief near his house. He used to shoot game for them. Kurtz wanted the ivory and wouldn't hear reason, declaring he'd shoot the Russian unless he gave it up and cleared out of the country, because he could do so and had a fancy for it. Nothing on earth prevented him from killing whomever he pleased. It was true, too. The Russian gave him the ivory. What did he care? But he didn't clear out. He couldn't leave Kurtz. He had to be careful until they got friendly again for a time. Then Kurtz had his second illness. Afterwards, the Russian had to keep out of the way, but he didn't mind. Kurtz lived mostly in those villages on the lake. When he came down to the river, sometimes he would talk, and sometimes it was better to be careful. The man suffered too much. He hated all this, and somehow couldn't get away. When he had a chance, the Russian begged him to try to leave while there was time, offered to go back with him. Kurtz would say yes, then remain, go off on another ivory hunt, disappear for weeks, forget himself amongst these people. The narrator said he was mad. The Russian protested indignantly. Kurtz couldn't be mad if he'd heard him talk only 2 days ago. He wouldn't dare hint such a thing. While talking, the narrator had taken up his binoculars, sweeping the forest limit at each side and behind the house. The knowledge of people in that bush so silent and quiet as the ruined house itself made him uneasy. No sign on nature's face of this amazing tale, suggested in desolate exclamations, shrugs, interrupted phrases, hints ending in deep sighs. The woods were unmoved like a mask, heavy like a closed prison door, with an air of hidden knowledge, patient expectation, unapproachable silence. The Russian explained that only lately Kurtz had come down to the river, bringing all the Lake Tribe's fighting men. He'd been absent for months getting himself adored, the narrator supposed, and had come down unexpectedly with the apparent intention of making a raid across the river or downstream. The appetite for more ivory had got the better of less material aspirations, but he'd gotten much worse suddenly. The Russian had heard he was lying there helpless, and had come up, taking his chance. He was bad, very bad. The narrator directed his glass to the house. No signs of life, just the ruined roof, the long mud wall peeping above grass with 3 little square window holes, no two the same size. Then he made a brusque movement, and one of the remaining posts of the vanished fence leaped up in his field of view. He'd been struck at a distance by certain attempts at ornamentation, remarkable in the ruinous aspect of the place. Now with a nearer view, he threw his head back as if before a blow. Then he went carefully from post to post with his glass, and saw his mistake. These round knobs were not ornamental, but symbolic, expressive, puzzling, striking, disturbing, food for thought, and also for vultures, if any looked down, but at least for such ants as were industrious enough to ascend the poles. The heads on stakes would have been even more impressive if their faces hadn't been turned toward the house. Only one, the first he'd made out, faced his way. He wasn't as shocked as you might think. His start back was just surprise. He'd expected to see a knob of wood. He returned deliberately to the first he'd seen, and there it was, black, dried, sunken, with closed eyelids, a head that seemed to sleep atop the pole, and with shrunken dry lips showing a narrow white line of teeth. It was smiling too, smiling continuously at some endless and jocose dream of that eternal slumber. He wasn't disclosing trade secrets. The manager later said Kurtz's methods had ruined the district. He had no opinion on that, but wanted it understood there was nothing profitable about those heads on stakes. They only showed Kurtz lacked restraint in gratifying his various lusts, that something was missing in him, some small matter that, when the pressing need arose, couldn't be found under his magnificent eloquence. Whether Kurtz knew of this deficiency himself he couldn't say. He thought the knowledge came at last, only at the very last. But the wilderness had found him out early, and taken terrible vengeance for his fantastic invasion. It must have whispered things about himself he didn't know, things he had no conception of until he took counsel with that great solitude, and the whisper proved irresistibly fascinating. It echoed loudly within him because he was hollow at the core. He put down the glass, and the head that had seemed near enough to speak to leaped away into inaccessible distance. Kurtz's admirer was crestfallen. In a hurried, indistinct voice, he assured the narrator he hadn't dared to take those symbols down. He wasn't afraid of the natives. They wouldn't stir until Kurtz gave the word. His ascendancy was extraordinary. The camps of these people surrounded the place. The chiefs came every day to see him. They would crawl. The narrator shouted that he didn't want to know any ceremony. Such details would be more intolerable than those drying heads. That was only a savage sight, while he seemed transported into a lightless region of subtle horrors, where pure, uncomplicated savagery was a positive relief, having a right to exist in the sunshine. The young man looked surprised. It didn't occur to him that Kurtz was no idol of the narrator's. He forgot the narrator, hadn't heard any of those splendid monologues about love, justice, conduct of life. If crawling was required, the Russian crawled as much as any savage. The young man said the narrator had no idea of the conditions. Those heads were rebels. The narrator laughed, shocking him. Rebels? Those rebellious heads looked very subdued on their sticks. Kurtz's last disciple cried out, that the narrator didn't know how such a life tried a man like Kurtz. The narrator asked what about him. The Russian protested. He was a simple man with no great thoughts who wanted nothing from anybody. How could he be compared? His feelings overcame him. He groaned that he didn't understand. He'd been doing his best to keep Kurtz alive, and that was enough. He'd had no hand in any of this. He had no abilities. There hadn't been a drop of medicine or a mouthful of invalid food for months. Kurtz had been shamefully abandoned. A man like that, with such ideas, shamefully. He hadn't slept for the last 10 nights. His voice faded into the calm evening. The long forest shadows had slipped downhill while they talked, far beyond the ruined hovel and the symbolic row of stakes. All that lay in gloom while they stood in sunshine. The river stretched abreast of the clearing, glittering in still, dazzling splendor, with murky bends above and below. Not a living soul on the shore. The bushes didn't rustle. Suddenly a group of men appeared around the house corner as if from the ground, wading waist-deep in grass in a compact body bearing an improvised stretcher. Instantly, a shrill cry arose, piercing the still air like an arrow to the land's very heart. As if by enchantment, streams of naked human beings with spears, bows, shields, wild glances, savage movements poured into the clearing from the dark-faced, pensive forest. The bushes shook, the grass swayed, then everything stood still in attentive immobility. The Russian said at his elbow that if Kurtz didn't say the right thing to them, they were all done for. The knot of men with the stretcher had stopped halfway to the steamer, petrified. The man on the stretcher sat up lank, with uplifted arm above the bearer's shoulders. The narrator remarked that perhaps the man who could talk so well of love in general would find some particular reason to spare them this time. He resented the absurd danger, being at the mercy of that atrocious phantom. Through his glasses, he saw the thin arm extended commandingly, the lower jaw moving, the eyes shining darkly in the bony head that nodded with grotesque jerks. Kurtz, meaning short in German, looked at least 7 feet long. His covering had fallen off, his body emerging pitiful and appalling as from a winding sheet, the cage of his ribs all astir, the bones of his arm waving an animated image of death, carved from old ivory, shaking its hand with menaces at a motionless crowd of dark, glittering bronze men. He opened his mouth wide with a weirdly voracious aspect, as if wanting to swallow all the air, all the earth, all the men before him. A deep voice reached him faintly. He must have been shouting. Then he fell back suddenly. The stretcher shook as the bearers staggered forward, and almost simultaneously the crowd of savages vanished without perceptible retreat, as if the forest that had ejected them so suddenly had drawn them back in like a long aspiration. Some pilgrims behind the stretcher carried Kurtz's arms 2 shotguns, a heavy rifle, a light revolver carbine, the thunderbolts of that pitiful Jupiter. The manager bent over him, murmuring as he walked beside his head. They laid him in one of the little cabins, just room for a bed place and a camp stool or 2. They'd brought his belated correspondence, torn envelopes, and open letters littered his bed. His hand roamed feebly among the papers. The narrator was struck by the fire of his eyes and the composed languor of his expression, not so much exhaustion of disease. He didn't seem in pain. This shadow looked satiated and calm, as though it had had its fill of all the emotions. He rustled one of the letters, looked straight at the narrator, and said he was glad. Somebody had been writing to him about the narrator, those special recommendations turning up again. The volume of tone he emitted without effort, almost without moving his lips, amazed him. A voice, grave, profound, vibrating, while the man seemed incapable of a whisper. He had enough strength, factitious, no doubt, to nearly make an end of them, as would be heard directly. The manager appeared silently in the doorway. The narrator stepped out at once. The manager drew the curtain after him. The Russian, eyed curiously by the pilgrims, stared at the shore. The narrator followed his glance. Dark human shapes could be made out in the distance, flitting indistinctly against the gloomy forest border. Near the river, 2 bronze figures leaned on tall spears in the sunlight, under fantastic headdresses of spotted skins, warlike and still in statuesque repose, and from right to left along the lighted shore moved a wild and gorgeous apparition of a woman. She walked with measured steps, draped in striped and fringed cloths, treading proudly with slight jingle and flash of barbarous ornaments. Her head high, her hair in the shape of a helmet, brass leggings to the knee, brass wire gauntlets to the elbow, a crimson spot on her tawny cheek, innumerable glass bead necklaces, bizarre things, charms, witch men's gifts hung about her, glittering and trembling at every step. She must have had the value of several elephant tusks upon her, savage and superb, wild-eyed and magnificent, something ominous and stately in her deliberate progress. In the hush that fell suddenly upon the whole sorrowful land, the immense wilderness, the colossal body of fecund and mysterious life, seemed to look at her, pensive, as if looking at the image of its own tenebrous and passionate soul. She came abreast of the steamer, stood still, and faced them. Her long shadow fell to the water's edge. Her face had a tragic, fierce aspect of wild sorrow and dumb pain, mingled with the fear of some struggling, half-shaped resolve. She stood looking without a stir, like the wilderness itself, brooding over an inscrutable purpose. A whole minute passed, then she made a step forward, a low jingle, a glint of yellow metal, a sway of fringed draperies, and stopped, as if her heart had failed her. The young man by his side growled. The pilgrims murmured at his back. She looked at them all as if her life depended on the unswerving steadiness of her glance. Suddenly, she opened her bared arms and threw them up rigid above her head, as if in an uncontrollable desire to touch the sky, and at the same time swift shadows darted out on the earth, swept around the river, gathering the steamer into a shadowy embrace. A formidable silence hung over the scene. She turned away slowly, walked on following the bank, and passed into the bushes to the left. Once only her eyes gleamed back in the dusk of the thickets before she disappeared. The man of patches said nervously that if she had offered to come aboard, he really thought he would have tried to shoot her. He'd been risking his life every day for the last fortnight to keep her out of the house. She got in one day and kicked up a row about those miserable rags he'd picked up to mend his clothes with. He wasn't decent, at least that must have been it, because she talked like a fury to Kurtz for an hour, pointing at him now and then. He didn't understand the dialect. Luckily for him, Kurtz felt too ill that day to care, or there would have been mischief. It was too much for him. Well, it was all over now. Then the narrator heard Kurtz's deep voice behind the curtain. Save him, save the ivory, he meant. Don't tell him. Save him? He'd had to save the manager. The manager was interrupting his plans now. Sick? Not as sick as they'd like to believe. Never mind. He'd carry his ideas out, yet he would return. He'd show what could be done. The manager, with his little peddling notions, was interfering. He would return. The manager came out, took the narrator's arm, and led him aside. He said Kurtz was very low, very low. He sighed, but neglected to be consistently sorrowful. They'd done all they could, hadn't they? But there was no disguising that Kurtz had done more harm than good to the company. He hadn't seen the time wasn't ripe for vigorous action. Cautiously, that was the manager's principle. They must be cautious yet. The district was closed to them for a time. Deplorable. Upon the whole, trade would suffer. There was a remarkable quantity of ivory, mostly fossil. They must save it at all events. But look how precarious the position was, and why? Because the method was unsound. The narrator asked, looking at the shore, whether he called it unsound method. The manager exclaimed hotly that he did, didn't he? The narrator murmured after a while that it was no method at all. Exactly. The manager exulted. He'd anticipated this. It showed complete want of judgment. It was his duty to point it out in the proper quarters. The narrator observed that the brickmaker would make a readable report for him. The manager appeared confounded for a moment. The narrator felt he'd never breathed such a vile atmosphere, and turned mentally to Kurtz for relief, positively, for relief. Nevertheless, he said with emphasis that he thought Kurtz was a remarkable man. The manager started, dropped a cold, heavy glance on him, said very quietly, he was, and turned his back. His hour of favor was over. He found himself lumped with Kurtz as a partisan of methods for which the time wasn't ripe. He was unsound, but at least he had a choice of nightmares. He had turned to the wilderness really, not to Kurtz, who was as good as buried. For a moment, he felt as if he too were buried in a vast grave full of unspeakable secrets, an intolerable weight oppressing his breast, the smell of damp earth, the unseen presence of victorious corruption, the darkness of an impenetrable night. The Russian tapped his shoulder, mumbling and stammering about Brother Seaman not being able to conceal knowledge of matters that would affect Kurtz's reputation. He waited. For the Russian. Kurtz was not in his grave one of the immortals, he suspected. He told him to speak out as it happened. He was Kurtz's friend in a way. The Russian stated with formality that had they not been of the same profession, he would have kept the matter to himself without regard to consequences. He suspected active ill will towards him from these white men. The narrator agreed. Remembering a conversation he'd overheard, the manager thought the Russian ought to be hanged. The Russian showed concern, then said he had better get out of the way quietly. He could do no more for Kurtz now, and they'd soon find an excuse. What was to stop them? There was a military post 300 miles away. The narrator suggested. Perhaps he'd better go if he had friends among the savages nearby. Plenty. The Russian said simple people, and he wanted nothing. He stood biting his lip, then said he didn't want harm to happen to these whites, but of course he was thinking of Kurtz's reputation. But the narrator was a brother seaman. The narrator said after a time that Kurtz's reputation was safe with him. He did not know how truly he spoke. Lowering his voice, the Russian informed him that Kurtz had ordered the attack on the steamer. He hated the idea of being taken away sometimes, but then again, the Russian didn't understand these matters. He was a simple man. Kurtz had thought it would scare them away, make them give up believing him dead. The Russian couldn't stop him. He'd had an awful time this last month. The narrator said Kurtz was all right now. The Russian muttered unconvincingly. The narrator thanked him and said he'd keep his eyes open. The Russian urged quiet. It would be awful for Kurtz's reputation if anyone here knew. The narrator promised complete discretion. The Russian had a canoe and 3 blackfellows waiting nearby. He was off. Could he have a few Martini Henry cartridges? The narrator gave them secretly. The Russian helped himself to tobacco with a wink, good English tobacco between sailors. At the pilot-house door he turned and asked for spare shoes, raising one leg to show soles tied with knotted strings sandal-wise under bare feet. The narrator found an old pair. The Russian admired them before tucking one under his left arm. One bright red pocket bulged with cartridges from the other, dark blue, piqued Towson's book. He seemed excellently equipped for another encounter with the wilderness. He would never meet such a man again. The narrator should have heard Kurtz recite poetry, his own too. Poetry. He rolled his eyes at the recollection. Kurtz had enlarged his mind. They shook hands, and he vanished into the night. Sometimes the narrator wondered if he'd ever really seen him, if such a phenomenon could exist. Waking shortly after midnight, the Russian's warning came back with its hint of danger, real enough in the starred darkness to make him get up for a look around. On the hill, a big fire burned, illuminating a crooked corner of the station house fitfully. One agent with a picket of armed blacks kept guard over the ivory. Deep in the forest, red gleams wavered, sinking and rising from the ground amongst confused columnar shapes of intense blackness, the exact position of the camp where Kurtz's adorers kept uneasy vigil. The monotonous beat of a big drum filled the air with muffled shocks and lingering vibration. A steady droning of many men chanting weird incantations came from the black wall of the woods like bees from a hive, with a strange narcotic effect on his half-awake senses. He believed he dozed off leaning over the rail, until an abrupt burst of yells, an overwhelming outbreak of pent-up mysterious frenzy woke him bewildered. It was cut short all at once, and the low droning resumed with an effect of audible, soothing silence. He glanced casually into the little cabin. A light burned within, but Kurtz was not there. He would have raised an outcry if he'd believed his eyes, but he didn't believe them at first. The thing seemed impossible. He was completely unnerved by sheer blank fright, pure abstract terror, unconnected with any distinct physical danger. What made it so overpowering was the moral shock, as if something monstrous, intolerable to thought, odious to the soul, had been thrust upon him unexpectedly. It lasted a fraction of a second. Then the usual sense of commonplace deadly danger, the possibility of sudden onslaught and massacre, became positively welcome and composing. It pacified him so much he did not raise an alarm. An agent in an ulster slept on a chair on deck within 3 feet of him. The yells hadn't wakened him. He snored slightly. The narrator left him to his slumbers and leaped ashore. He did not betray Kurtz. It was ordered he should never betray him, written he should be loyal to the nightmare of his choice. He was anxious to deal with his shadow by himself alone, jealous of sharing the peculiar blackness of that experience. On the bank he saw a broad trail through the grass. He remembered the exultation of telling himself that Kurtz couldn't walk. He was crawling on all fours. He had him. The grass was wet with dew. He strode rapidly with clenched fists, with some vague notion of falling upon Kurtz and giving him a drubbing. Imbecile thoughts came. The knitting old woman with the cat obtruded as an improper person to be at the other end of such an affair. He saw a row of pilgrims squirting lead in the air from Winchesters held to the hip. He thought he would never get back to the steamer, imagined himself living alone and unarmed in the woods to an advanced age. He confused the drumbeat with his heartbeat, and was pleased at its calm regularity. He kept to the track, then stopped to listen. The night was very clear, dark blue space sparkling with dew and starlight, black things standing very still. He thought he could see motion ahead. Strangely cocksure, he left the track and ran in a wide semicircle, chuckling to himself, to get in front of that motion, circumventing Kurtz as if it were a boyish game. He came upon him. If Kurtz hadn't heard him coming, he would have fallen over him. But Kurtz got up in time, unsteady, long, pale, indistinct as a vapor exhaled by earth, swaying slightly, misty and silent. Behind him, fires loomed between trees, and many voices murmured from the forest. He'd cut him off cleverly, but when actually confronting him, he came to his senses, saw the danger in its right proportion. It was by no means over. Suppose Kurtz began to shout. Though he could hardly stand, there was still plenty of vigor in his voice. Kurtz told him to go away, hide himself, in that profound tone, very awful. He glanced back. They were within 30 yards of the nearest fire. A black figure stood up, strode on long black legs, waving long black arms across the glow. It had horns, antelope horns on its head. Some sorcerer, witchman, fiend-like enough. He whispered whether Kurtz knew what he was doing. Kurtz answered perfectly. Raising his voice for that single word, it sounded far off yet loud, like a hail through a speaking trumpet. If he made a row, they were lost. This was not a case for fisticuffs. Apart from his natural aversion to beating that shadow, that wandering, tormented thing, he told Kurtz he would be utterly lost. He said the right thing, though Kurtz could not have been more irretrievably lost than at that moment, when the foundations of their intimacy were being laid to endure even to the end, even beyond. Kurtz muttered irresolutely about immense plans. The narrator said yes, but if he tried to shout, he'd smash his head. There was no stick or stone near, so he corrected himself that he would throttle him for good. Kurtz pleaded that he was on the threshold of great things, with a wistfulness that made his blood run cold. And now for this stupid scoundrel. The narrator affirmed steadily that Kurtz's success in Europe was assured in any case. He didn't want to throttle him. It would be very little use for any practical purpose. He tried to break the spell, the heavy, mute spell of the wilderness that seemed to draw Kurtz to its pitiless breast, by awakening forgotten brutal instincts and memories of gratified monstrous passions. This alone, he was convinced, had driven Kurtz to the edge of the forest, towards the gleam of fires, the throb of drums, the drone of incantations. This alone had beguiled his unlawful soul beyond permitted aspirations. The terror of the position was not being knocked on the head, though he had a lively sense of that danger too, but having to deal with a being to whom he could not appeal in the name of anything high or low. He had, like the natives, to invoke Kurtz himself, his own exalted and incredible degradation. There was nothing above or below him. And he knew it. Kurtz had kicked himself loose of the earth, kicked the very earth to pieces. He was alone, and the narrator before him didn't know whether he stood on ground or floated in air. He'd been telling them what they said, repeating the phrases, but what good? They were common everyday words, but behind them lay the terrific suggestiveness of words heard in dreams, phrases spoken in nightmares. Soul? If anyone had ever struggled with a soul, he was that man. And he wasn't arguing with a lunatic either. Kurtz's intelligence was perfectly clear, concentrated upon himself with horrible intensity, yet clear, and therein was his only chance, barring killing him there and then, which wasn't good because of unavoidable noise. But his soul was mad, alone in the wilderness. It had looked within itself and gone mad. He had to go through the ordeal of looking into it himself. No eloquence could have been so withering to one's belief in mankind as Kurtz's final burst of sincerity. He struggled with himself too. He saw it, heard it. He saw the inconceivable mystery of a soul that knew no restraint, no faith, no fear, yet struggled blindly with itself. He kept his head pretty well, but when he had Kurtz at last stretched on the couch, he wiped his forehead while his legs shook as though he'd carried half a ton down that hill, yet he'd only supported Kurtz, his bony arm around the narrator's neck, and he was no heavier than a child. When they left at noon the next day, the crowd of whose presence behind the curtain of trees he had been acutely conscious all the time flowed out of the woods again, filled the clearing, covered the slope with a mass of naked, breathing, quivering bronze bodies. He steamed up a bit, then swung downstream, and 2,000 eyes followed the evolutions of the splashing, thumping, fiery river demon beating the water with its terrible tail and breathing black smoke. In front of the first rank along the river, 3 men plastered with bright red earth from head to foot strutted restlessly. When they came abreast again, they faced the river, stamped their feet, nodded their horned heads, swayed their scarlet bodies, shook toward the fierce river demon, a bunch of black feathers, a mangy skin with a pendant tail, something like a dried gourd. They shouted periodic strings of amazing words resembling no human language, and the deep murmurs of the crowd, interrupted suddenly, were like responses to a satanic litany. They had carried Kurtz into the pilot house for more air. Lying on the couch, he stared through the open shutter. An eddy formed in the mass of human bodies, and the woman with helmeted head and tawny cheeks rushed to the very brink of the stream. She put out her hands, shouted something, and the wild mob took up the shout in a roaring chorus of articulated, rapid, breathless utterance. The narrator asked if he understood. Kurtz kept looking out past him with fiery, longing eyes, a mingled expression of wistfulness and hate. He made no answer, but a smile of indefinable meaning appeared on his colorless lips, which a moment after twitched convulsively. He said slowly, gasping as if the words were torn from him by a supernatural power, that he did. The narrator pulled the whistle string because he saw the pilgrims on deck getting out their rifles, anticipating a jolly lark. At the sudden screech, abject terror moved through the wedged mass of bodies. Someone on deck cried out not to frighten them away. He pulled the string time after time. They broke and ran, leaped, crouched, swerved, dodged the flying terror of the sound. The 3 red men had fallen flat, face down, as if shot dead. Only the barbarous and superb woman did not flinch, stretching her bare arms tragically after them over the somber and glittering river. Then the imbecile crowd on deck started their little fun, and he could see nothing more for smoke. The brown current ran swiftly out of the heart of darkness, bearing them down toward the sea with twice their upward speed. Kurtz's life ran swiftly too, ebbing out of his heart into the sea of inexorable time. The manager was very placid, with no vital anxieties now, taking them both in with a comprehensive, satisfied glance. The affair had come off as well as could be wished. The narrator saw the time approaching when he would be left alone of the party of unsound method. The pilgrims looked upon him with disfavor. He was, so to speak, numbered with the dead. Strange how he accepted this unforeseen partnership, this choice of nightmares forced upon him in the tenebrous land invaded by those mean and greedy phantoms. The narrator recalled how Kurtz had spoken a voice that resonated with deep power, even at the end. masking the hollow darkness inside. Kurtz had struggled fiercely, his exhausted mind haunted by shadowy images of wealth and fame that circled around his gift for lofty speech. He would talk of his intended, his ivory, his station, his career, his ideas, each a subject for elevated sentiments. The original Kurt seemed like a ghost, visiting the bedside of the hollow shell that would soon be buried in primitive earth. Meanwhile, demonic love and unearthly hate from the mysteries he'd uncovered fought to claim his soul, a soul glutted on raw emotions, hungry for false fame and the trappings of success. Sometimes Kurtz became contemptibly childish, imagining kings greeting him at train stations upon his return from some desolate nowhere. He advised showing people truly profitable work, claiming recognition would then have no limits, though one must always cite the right motives. The endless, monotonous riverbanks slid past the steamer ancient trees, watching this grimy fragment of another world, forerunner of change and conquest. While the narrator focused on piloting ahead, Kurtz suddenly demanded the shutter closed, unable to bear the view. The narrator obeyed. After a silence, Kurtz cried out that he would still wring the narrator's heart. They broke down as expected, and had to repair at an island's head. This delay first shook Kurtz's confidence. One morning he handed over a packet of papers and a photograph tied with shoestring, asking the narrator to keep them safe, saying the manager might pry into his boxes. That afternoon, the narrator found Kurtz lying on his back with eyes closed. Withdrawing quietly, he heard Kurtz mutter something about living rightly then dying nothing more. Whether rehearsing a speech or reciting a newspaper fragment, Kurtz had been writing for papers and intended to continue, considering it a duty to further his ideas. Kurtz remained impenetrably dark. The narrator saw him as a man at the bottom of a sunless precipice, but had little time to give, busy helping the engine driver dismantle leaky cylinders and straighten a bent connecting rod. He lived in a mess of rust, tools, and scrap things he abominated, tending a small forge when not too shaky to stand. One evening, entering with a candle, the narrator heard Kurtz say tremulously that he lay in the dark waiting for death, though the light was nearly in his eyes. The narrator forced a dismissive murmur and stood transfixed. The change on Kurtz's face was unlike anything the narrator had seen before, or hoped to see again, not touching him but fascinating him, as if a veil had torn. That ivory face held somber pride, ruthless power, craven terror, intense and hopeless despair. Whether Kurtz relived his entire life in that moment of complete knowledge, the narrator couldn't know, but Kurtz whispered twice at some vision, a breath of a cry horror. The narrator blew out the candle and left. The pilgrims dined in a mess room. He sat across from the manager, ignoring the man's questioning glance. The manager leaned back with a serene, secretive smile. Flies swarmed the lamp, the cloth, their hands and faces. Then the manager's boy thrust his head in and announced with contempt that Kurtz was dead. All the pilgrims rushed out. The narrator remained and continued eating, knowing he appeared brutally callous, though he didn't eat much. Light inside, beastly dark outside. He went no nearer the man who had pronounced judgment on his soul's adventures. The voice was gone. Next day, the pilgrims buried something in a muddy hole. Then they nearly buried the narrator. But he didn't join Kurtz. He stayed to dream the nightmare to its end and show loyalty once more. Destiny. Life a droll, mercilessly logical arrangement for a futile purpose. The most one can hope for is self-knowledge that comes too late, and unextinguishable regrets. He had wrestled with death, the most unexciting contest, taking place in impalpable grayness with nothing underfoot, no spectators, no glory, no desire for victory or fear of defeat, in tepid skepticism, little belief in one's own right, and less in the adversary's. If that was ultimate wisdom, life was an even greater riddle. He'd been a hair's breadth from his last pronouncement, and realized with humiliation he would have had nothing to say. That was why Kurtz was remarkable. He had something to say and said it. Having peered over the edge himself, the narrator understood better Kurtz's stare, wide enough to embrace the universe, piercing enough to penetrate every heart. Kurtz had summed up and judged. That whisper of horror was an expression of belief, candor, conviction, a note of revolt, the appalling face of glimpsed truth, desire, and hate commingled. The narrator didn't remember his own extremity as well, a formless gray vision of physical pain and careless contempt for all evanescence. No, he remembered living through Kurtz's extremity. Kurtz had made that last stride over the edge, while the narrator drew back his hesitating foot. Perhaps all wisdom and truth were compressed into that inappreciable moment of stepping over. The narrator liked to think his own summing up wouldn't have been careless contempt. Better Kurtz's cry and affirmation, a moral victory paid for by defeats, terrors, and abominable satisfactions. That was why he remained loyal to Kurtz, even beyond, when he later heard not the voice itself but its echo, from a soul pure as crystal. They didn't bury him, though he remembered a misty period of shuddering wonder, a passage through an inconceivable world without hope or desire. He found himself back in the sepulchral city, resenting people hurrying to steal money, devour cookery, gulp beer, dream silly dreams. They intruded on his thoughts. Their assured safe bearing offended him like folly flaunted before incomprehensible danger. He didn't want to enlighten them, but had to restrain himself from laughing in their stupidly important faces. He admitted his behavior was inexcusable, but his temperature was seldom normal. His aunt's efforts to nurse his strength missed the point. Not his strength, but his imagination needed soothing. He kept Kurtz's papers, unsure what to do. Kurtz's mother had died, watched over by his intended. A clean-shaven official man with gold-rimmed spectacles came asking circuitously about certain documents. The narrator had already refused the manager and refused this man too. The visitor darkly menaced, arguing the company had rights to information about its territories, claiming Kurtz's knowledge of unexplored regions due to his abilities and deplorable circumstances must be extensive and peculiar. The narrator assured him Kurtz's knowledge didn't bear on commerce or administration. The man invoked science then. The narrator offered the suppression of savage customs report with the postscript torn off. The man sniffed contemptuously, saying this wasn't what they had a right to expect. The narrator told him to expect nothing else, only private letters. The man withdrew with legal threats. 2 days later, a man claiming to be Kurtz's cousin appeared, wanting details of Kurtz's last moments. He implied Kurtz had been a great musician, a potential immense success. The narrator had no reason to doubt it, and still couldn't say what Kurtz's profession was, if he ever had one. He'd taken Kurtz for a painter who wrote or a journalist who painted, but even the snuff-taking cousin couldn't say exactly. He agreed. The cousin was a universal genius, after which the old man noisily blew his nose and withdrew with unimportant family letters. Ultimately, a journalist turned up, anxious about his dear colleague. This visitor insisted Kurtz's proper sphere should have been popular side politics. He had straight furry eyebrows, cropped hair, an eyeglass on black ribbon, and confessed Kurtz couldn't write at all but how he could talk. He electrified meetings. He had the faith, could believe anything. He would have been a splendid extremist party leader. When asked which party, the journalist answered any party. Kurtz was an extremist. The narrator agreed. Suddenly curious, the journalist asked what induced Kurtz to go out there. The narrator said yes, and handed over the famous report for publication. The journalist hurried through it, judged it would do, and left with his plunder. The narrator was left with a slim packet of letters and the girl's portrait. She struck him as beautiful, meaning a beautiful expression. Sunlight can lie, but no manipulation of light and pose could have conveyed that delicate truthfulness on her features. She seemed ready to listen without reservation, suspicion, or thought for herself. He decided to return her portrait and letters personally. Curiosity, perhaps, and some other feeling. Everything that had been Kurtz's had passed from his hands: soul, body, station, plans, ivory, career. Only Kurtz's memory and his intended remained, and the narrator wanted to surrender those two to oblivion. He didn't defend himself. He had no clear perception of what he really wanted, an impulse of unconscious loyalty, or the fulfillment of some ironic necessity. He didn't know, but he went. the narrator admitted. He had once thought Kurtz's memory would fade like all other memories of the dead, a vague impress of shadows that had fallen and passed. But standing before that high, ponderous door on a street, as still as a cemetery alley, he saw a vision of Kurtz on the stretcher, mouth open voraciously, as if to devour the whole earth. Kurtz lived before him then, a shadow, insatiable for splendid appearances and frightful realities, darker than night, draped in gorgeous eloquence. The vision seemed to enter the house with him, the stretcher, phantom bearers, the obedient worshippers, forest gloom, river glitter, the muffled drumbeat like a conquering darkness's heart. It felt like a moment of triumph for the wilderness, an invading rush he alone would have to keep back for another soul's salvation. Broken phrases from the fireside in the patient woods came back, the abject pleading, the abject threats, the colossal vile desires, the meanness, torment, tempestuous anguish. Later, he recalled Kurtz's collected, languid manner when claiming that lot of ivory was really his, collected at great personal risk, the company not having paid for it. Kurtz had feared they would claim it, asked what to do, said he wanted no more than justice. Just that, no more than justice. The narrator rang the bell before a mahogany door, and while waiting, Kurtz seemed to stare at him from the glassy panel with that immense stare condemning the universe. He seemed to hear the whispered cry of horror. Dusk was falling. He waited in a lofty drawing room with 3 long windows like luminous draped columns. Gilt furniture shone in indistinct curves. The tall marble fireplace had cold, monumental whiteness. A grand piano stood massively in a corner like a polished sarcophagus. A high door opened and closed. He rose. She came forward, all in black, pale head floating toward him in the dusk. More than a year had passed since Kurtz's death, but she seemed as though she would mourn forever. She took both his hands and murmured that she had heard he was coming. He noticed she was not girlish, but had a mature capacity for fidelity, belief, suffering. The room seemed darker, as if the cloudy evening's sad light had taken refuge on her forehead. Her fair hair, pale visage, pure brow seemed surrounded by an ashy halo from which dark eyes looked out guileless, profound, confident. She carried her sorrowful head, as if proud of that sorrow, as if only she knew how to mourn him properly. But then, a look of awful desolation crossed her face, and he saw she was not time's plaything. For her, Kurtz had died only yesterday. The impression was so powerful that for the narrator too, Kurtz seemed to have died just this minute. He saw her and Kurtz together in the same instant, his death and her sorrow. She said with a deep breath that she had survived, while his strained ears seemed to hear mingled with her despair the summing up whisper of eternal condemnation. Panic rose. He felt he had blundered into cruel, absurd mysteries. She motioned him to a chair. He set the packet gently on a small table, and she put her hand over it. After a morning silence, she murmured that he had known Kurtz well. He replied that intimacy grows quickly out there, that he had known Kurtz as well as one man can know another. She asked if he had admired Kurtz, saying it was impossible to know him and not admire him. Unsteadily, he called Kurtz a remarkable man. Under her appealing gaze, he began to say it was impossible not to, and she eagerly finished love him. The words silenced him in appalled dumbness. She declared how true it was, that no one knew Kurtz as well as she, that she had all his noble confidence. He repeated that she knew him best, and perhaps she did. With every word, the room darkened, only her forehead remaining lit by unextinguishable belief and love. She said he must have been Kurtz's friend to have been sent with the packet. She needed to speak, wanted him, who had heard Kurtz's last words to know she had been worthy of him. It wasn't pride, she was proud to have understood him better than anyone. He had told her so himself. Since his mother died, she had had no one. He listened as the darkness deepened. He wasn't even sure he had the right bundle. He suspected Kurtz had wanted him to safeguard another batch that he later saw the manager examining. The girl talked, easing her pain in the certainty of his sympathy, talking like a thirsty person drinks. He had heard that her engagement had been disapproved by her people. Kurtz wasn't rich enough. The narrator didn't know if Kurtz had been a pauper all his life, but had inferred that impatience with comparative poverty drove him out there. She continued, asking who was not Kurtz's friend after hearing him speak once. He drew men toward him by their best qualities. Her low voice seemed accompanied by every mysterious, desolate, sorrowful sound the narrator had ever heard: river ripple, wind in trees, wild crowd murmurs, incomprehensible words from afar, a whisper from beyond eternal darkness. But he had heard Kurtz, he knew. She cried this out. With despair in his heart, he said yes. He knew, bowing his head before her faith, before that great saving illusion glowing in the triumphant darkness he could not defend her from, nor even himself. She mourned the loss to her, to them, to the world. In the last twilight, he saw the glitter of her tear-filled eyes, tears that would not fall. She said she had been very happy, very fortunate, very proud, too fortunate, too happy for a little while, and now unhappy for life. She stood up. Her fair hair caught the remaining light. He rose too. She said of all Kurtz's promise, greatness, generous mind, noble heart, nothing remained but a memory, just the two of them. He hastily said they would always remember him. She cried that it couldn't all be lost, that such a life should leave nothing but sorrow. She knew of his vast plans. Something must remain. His words at least had not died. He agreed his words would remain. She whispered to herself about his example, how men looked up to him, how his goodness shone in every act. He said true. His example too, he had forgotten that. But she could not yet believe she would never see him again. She stretched out her arms black against the window, clasping pale hands, as if after a retreating figure. He would see that eloquent phantom as long as he lived, and her too, a tragic shade like another he remembered, stretching bare brown arms over the infernal stream of darkness. She said very low that Kurtz died as he lived. Dull anger stirred in the narrator as he said Kurtz's end was worthy of his life. She murmured that she was not with him. His anger subsided into infinite pity. He mumbled that everything that could be done had been done. But she insisted she had believed in him more than anyone, more than his own mother, more than himself. He needed her. She would have treasured every sigh, every word, every sigh, every glance. A chill gripped his chest. He muffled a plea for her to stop. She asked forgiveness, saying she had mourned so long in silence. She thought of his loneliness. No one near to understand him as she would have, perhaps no one to hear. Shakily, he said he had been there to the very end, that he had heard Kurtz's last words, then stopped in fright. She repeated in a heartbroken tone that she wanted something to live with, asked him to repeat the words. He was on the point of crying out, asking if she didn't hear them. The dusk was repeating them in a persistent, menacing whisper all around, swelling like a rising wind horror. She murmured his last word to live with, then cried out that she had loved him. He pulled himself together and spoke slowly. The last word Kurtz pronounced had been her name. A light sigh. Then his heart stopped at an exulting, terrible cry of inconceivable triumph and unspeakable pain. She knew it, she was sure. She wept into her hands. He felt the house would collapse, the heavens fall upon his head. But nothing happened. The heavens don't fall for such a trifle. Would they have fallen, he wondered, if he had rendered Kurtz that justice which was his due? Hadn't Kurtz said he wanted only justice? But he couldn't tell her. It would have been too dark, altogether too dark. Marlowe ceased, sitting apart, indistinct and silent like a meditating Buddha. No one moved. The director noted they had lost the first of the ebb. The narrator raised his head. The offing was barred by a black bank of clouds, and the tranquil waterway leading to the uttermost ends of the earth flowed somber under an overcast sky, seemed to lead into the heart of an immense darkness. The end. Thank you for spending this time with the story and allowing it to unfold with patience and curiosity. Heart of Darkness was born from Joseph Conrad's own harrowing journey as a steamboat captain on the Congo River in 1890. He witnessed colonial cruelty firsthand: chained workers, abandoned outposts, and a brutal disregard for human life. Writing almost a decade later, Conrad transformed that trauma into a framed narrative, using an unreliable storyteller, Marlowe, to explore how easily civilization cracks. The novella arrived in 1899, during Europe's feverish colonial scramble for Africa. Philosophers like Schopenhauer had already questioned whether reason truly rules humanity. Conrad took that doubt and gave it a jungle, a river, and a whisper: the horror, the horror. He struggled terribly to write it. Conrad spoke Polish and French as his first languages. English was his third. He fought poverty, depression, and near paralysis from gout. Yet he pushed through, developing a dense impressionistic style, more painting than reportage, that forces readers to feel the fog, the lies, and the slow descent. Conrad later explored similar themes of isolation and obsession in Lord Jim and Nostromo. When filmmaker Francis Ford Coppola adapted the story as Apocalypse Now in 1979, he transplanted Kurtz from the Congo to the Vietnam War. The film is remarkably faithful to the novel's soul: the river journey, the mounting dread, the godlike madman, but changes nearly everything on the surface. Marlowe becomes Captain Willard. Kurtz's final words remain: the horror stays. Production was famously chaotic. Typhoons destroyed sets in the Philippines. Martin Sheen suffered a heart attack. Marlon Brando arrived enormously overweight and refused to learn his lines, so Coppola shot him mostly in shadow. One solution? Coppola improvised the entire ending, letting Brando speak whatever emerged. Somehow, it worked. Behind the scenes, the famous napalm strike opening, "I love the smell of napalm in the morning," was completely improvised by Robert Duvall on set. Fun fact: Conrad's original manuscript title was The Heart of Darkness. His publisher asked for something catchier. Conrad refused to change it. The original novel still holds layers that only the written word can fully reveal: the rhythm of Conrad's sentences, the deliberate ambiguity of whether Kurtz was ever saying, and the chilling final lie Marlowe tells Kurtz's fiancée. If you enjoyed this retelling, subscribing helps support more stories like this, and please share your thoughts below. What do you think the horror truly means? Share this story with someone who needs a reminder that darkness lives not in jungles, but in men. Until the next story, stay curious.